Okay, Mayor, we are live on YouTube.
Okay, it is 5 o'clock. And so shall we start the meeting? Bob Coomer's up. We got everybody on board? Okay, is all the logistics on your
Mayor,
end?
we are live on YouTube.
Okay, so logistics are all up, so we can start the meeting. Okay, with that, it's let's see, 5:02, and I will call this meeting to order and ask the city clerk to call the roll call, please.
Councilmember Monroe,
Here.
Councilmember Coomer,
Here.
Councilmember Carling,
Here.
Vice Mayor Warner,
Here.
Mayor Marchand.
I'm here. Okay, with that, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thank you. Now, an opportunity for the public to address the City Council on matters for consideration and the workshop item. Do we have anyone who wishes to speak to the council?
Mayor, no comments have been received.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the workshop item, AB 1234, the ethics training for local officials. We have to take 2 hours of training every 2 years. So with that, Mr. City Attorney.
Mr. Mayor, thank you very much. Yes, my name is Jason Alcala, and I am your city attorney. Honorable Mayor and city council members, this evening is your state-required training for ethics pursuant to AB 1234. What I'd like to do is just organize our evening as follows. I'd like to start off where we left off with your rules of procedure. When you adopted your rules of procedure, you also had the opportunity to establish expectations amongst yourselves relative to how to comply with the Brown Act and in certain forums. What I'd like to do is start off with that slide. There's 6 items for us to discuss and just to review for your expectations so you can come to a collective understanding. We'll then commence with the AB 1234 presentation. Those expectations will inform the AB 1234 presentation. You may have some questions that come up as we go through that, but I think we'll lay the baseline and our basic understanding, and we can always revisit those expectations as the presentation proceeds. So with that, let me start off with the first slide. Make sure everybody can see that. Okay, is that visible? Council expectations?
No.
Very good, very good.
Not
So
yet.
the first item we have here relative to the Brown Act.
That's not up yet.
Slide.
Excuse me?
Did you put up a slide? I don't see one.
I just see our faces still.
And they are lovely
All right.
faces, all of them.
Let's see what
Lots of
happens.
dogs.
Oh, you started. Oh, there we go. Okay, now we're up. This council expectations slide is up.
There we go. How about now?
There we go. Perfect.
Perfect, perfect. User error on my side. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So 6 items to start our conversation this evening that have various effects involving the Brown Act. The first of which is social media activities. As you'll recall, those who participated in this conversation last time, we had a conversation with regard to, do you as a council member have an expectation with regard to your online presence? For example, having an official website or blog or online presence where you are there as a council member. In the past, we've had situations and conversations regarding blogs that were operated and run by council members, and saying, is that something that is something you want to collectively come to an understanding to allow? And if so, what are the parameters? How is the Brown Act involved with that? It's involved with cross-talking and the ability to come to collective decision-making by having conversations in these social media platforms. So that's one thing. In the past, the council has had expectations that their official presence would be through the city's webpage. So that's where the public would go to obtain information about the city or the council members. So we'll be asking you today, is that where you want to be, or do you want to evolve that or change that? Another situation that is continuing to evolve with regard to the use of social media is the like function, for lack of a better description. So if there's a news article or someone has something on a Facebook page and you click the like button, is that something you want to avail yourselves of? And again, the Brown Act will tolerate that to a certain degree. If you start liking each other's comments, then the Brown Act says, okay, you're coming to a collective concurrence. And as we know, and we'll review later, that could lead to potentially a Brown Act violation through a daisy chain or hub and spoke. So I want to see if you guys have an expectation with regard to that level of activity. In the past, you as a council have collectively engaged to conduct yourself like you, when engaging in social media, like you do with the press. If there's a one-on-one conversation, you're speaking with a reporter, that's fine, and you use that same level of discourse when you're online, and in particular, even when you're writing, say, letters to the editor, responding in that way. So with that, I want to just turn this over to you to see, do you have an expectation relative to an official presence online with the additional understanding that there have been developments in this area? What are those developments? Personal Facebook pages that were used in an official capacity have been determined to be public forums. So what does that mean? Again, you can't, once it's a public forum, you can't discriminate based upon the speaker's viewpoint or who the speaker is. We saw this initially evolve with regard to a planning commissioner on the East Coast in a southern state. It has now actually evolved into the U.S. President's Facebook page, that he could not hide negative comments. So with that context, do you have an expectation you'd like to discuss, maybe change it with regard to social media presence or participation?
Okay, well, I'll start up. I know that there was
Can we go
concern.
back to seeing each other? Right now, we're just seeing it. It would be nice to see faces as we're having the discussion.
I will unshare my screen and let me figure out how to do that. There we go. There.
Thank
Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Councilmember Monroe, you had some comments?
No, I just wanted to see, I wanted to be able to see faces as we go. Go ahead. I will have comments, but no, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to see the faces.
Oh, I think one of the things where this started was a while back on the council, there was a council member who had their own personal blog. And as we were discussing issues with the city, they would be posting commentary about those issues on their blog. And that raised a number of Brown Act issues that Jason refers to, that there was information that all the council members were aware of. So it actually gave the impression that that council members' opinions were out in public. And then it advised the rest of the council what those opinions were. So it could be considered deliberations going on in the public that hadn't been agendized. So
Sorry,
there
I
was some.
didn't quite catch that. Could you please repeat it?
Oops, never mind. Siri is chiming in. So that was one of the concerns there. I think as long as we are articulating official council positions or providing public information, for example, something that I've done on Nextdoor, and I know some other folks have, if it's just official positions or general information, I don't believe we run afoul of the Brown Act because it's not a deliberative process. But I'm open up to other suggestions. Mr. Monroe.
Yeah, so I have pushed for us having the option of having council blogs and council, on wherever, and having social media presences that are officially city presences as compared to personal ones. And I recognize there can be some overlap there. I feel even more so, and I'm still trying to work out the Brown Act problems with that. What I have found in this time of pandemics and then with Black Lives Matter and so on is that there are things I would like to say as a council member that are I don't think they violate the Brown Act, but they probably don't belong on my personal page either. I would like to find a way to keep my role in speaking to people separate, so that there's a place where I'm speaking to the city and a place where I'm speaking to whoever my friends are or whatever. And I don't know, maybe there's not a way to do that comfortably, but I've seen it done in other cities, so I know there's some modeling for that, and yeah, that's what I'd like to see.
So, Mr. Mayor, this is Jason. If I can help guide this conversation, there are ways to manage that, both of which have legal and administrative issues we'd have to wrestle with. I don't want to make the platform for that conversation. This is just the initial conversation, which is if you would like to change that, or if there is a collective desire to do that, we as staff can return with some recommendations and some guiding principles for you to consider at a later date. But the question before this evening is, do you want to change that status quo of what we have? And if so, give us some broad guidance, and we can come back to you with something in the future.
You're on mute.
Well, it sounds like Councilmember Monroe would like to revisit that. Any other comments from the council members, or do you just want to bring that back for a more general discussion?
Yeah, I'm very happy with having Jason provide us with some guidance on this, and we'll look at it as we get down the line, because I didn't come equipped today to talk about social media policy, quite honestly. So,
okay, well, that gives 3 head nods.
Well, I want to ask Jason, do we collectively have to agree that we want to do this, or is it if Councilmember Monroe wants to do it, does that mean that I have to do it too?
No, right now, this is just, again, establishing your expectations. If there is a desire, and like we do during matters initiated, for us to return with an item for you to consider the parameters at a future meeting, we would take that direction and return to you at a future meeting. So you would not be making a decision here this evening.
My point is, I have no interest in doing this. None.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and
The
this is,
thing
sorry. So to be honest, I am probably one of the few mayors out there that does not have a Facebook page because I really have no interest in trying to maintain one. I think where this might come out is we have pushed information out over the city's Facebook page. So it may be a further discussion about how we push council information out, not necessarily our own individual, because I have no desire to have my own Facebook page either. I agree with Mr. Carling, but there may be opportunities where we do collectively decide to push out information, similar to what we did with the COVID-19 letters. I think those were very successful, very popular, and very highly regarded. So in extraordinary situations, they might work. I'm not interested in maintaining my own Facebook page, but there may be opportunities where we can use that to push information.
And I think it's the other way around. Right now, you have no interest in doing it, but I do, and because of council policy, I can't. And so it's not forcing you to do it; it's allowing me to do it. At least that's the way I see it.
Right, and that's what I mean. It's what does that look like? And as Dr. Carling said, he doesn't want to do it, but in your case, Councilmember Monroe, you do. So your hands back up. It went back down. Vice Mayor Warner. Are you back, Bob Carling?
no, I just wanted to wrap up. I guess I'm in favor of status quo. So.
Okay, all right. Vice Mayor?
Well, I think I can see the point of giving Councilmember Monroe his permission to do something, and I make sure that we're all not required or trying to compete with that. The other thing is, I do believe this is contained in or connected with how well we do it as a city, and I would hope that as a council, the city's position, the council's position is displayed on the city's website. I think the other thing here that Councilmember Monroe might be talking about is the speed. So for us to collectively agree on a position takes a couple of weeks. and there may be a need to respond more quickly. So I don't know how we could do a more quick response collectively. So in that case, it would be appropriate in my mind for one of the council members to go out there and be able to say something until we can get the collective position up.
Well, for example, we have legislative positions that we've already adopted. And when we have those are frequently letters that I will send out to the state indicating that, yes, this is our position. So we don't have to re-poll the entire council. So I think this is, if there is an adopted position, that makes it a little bit easier.
You're right.
So-
I think though that what we would ask the city attorney to come back with is the consideration of the speed at which things could happen as well. Because I think we have in advance, like you said, the legislation, we have the broader policy and people can interpret it and respond at the state level quickly within that policy. But on other issues, when something happens in the spur of the moment within the city that requires a response, I believe that what Councilmember Monroe is speaking to is the speed at which we do this as well. Is that true?
That is true. It is there, particularly in the last several months, we've seen places where things have been changing, continuing to change. I'm not going to say with the speed of light because there's physicists present, but feels like it sometimes.
Okay. Well, I think it warrants a discussion. Okay, looks like we got a
Very
few.
good.
Okay, Councilman Monroe, you got another comment? Councilmember Monroe?
Sorry,
did you
it was just forgot to put the hand down.
have- Okay, all right, very good. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So what I will do is we will take that direction. I will coordinate my resources with Mark's in the city manager's office and return with information for your consideration collectively as the city council with regard to some basic parameters that can be established for the use of social media to help guide it, one, and that is consistent with the Brown Act, and two, with a firm understanding of what administrative resources would be necessary to basically accommodate that and to manage that. Because since it is treated as a public forum, if it's a Facebook page, that would require compliance with the Public Records Act and records retention. So we can come back with a full discussion of what that looks like, as well as how to respond quickly to the community. We will also show what the parameters are as far as committing the city to a course of action, and we'll walk you through those issues. But thank you for that. The second item we have for council expectations is with regard to the city council members attending both city meetings and community meetings. And let me explain to you what I mean by city meetings. These are not your city council meetings. These would be meetings where you've given staff direction, say, to have a community meeting and gather outreach or engage the community to receive information and feedback. We've had situations where the staff has done that at a staff level and engaged the community, and we've had an interest from city council members to attend those particular meetings and events. The challenge becomes that if a council member attends, one is fine. If two attend, again, the Brown Act will contemplate that. You can have two. It's when you get to a majority. The challenge comes in if a majority of the city council members want to attend a meeting, what do you do relative to the council members who are already present and participating? Do we shuttle them out? Do we say first come, first serve, so the subsequent council members cannot participate and they're therefore closed from joining that meeting? Or can we go back, do we follow our policy, which is what we have now? The council expectation has been if it's a community meeting, council members don't attend, they allow staff to gather that information, prepare it, synthesize it, and report it back to them at a formal council meeting. However, if the city council member did want to attend, or a majority wanted to attend, there's a way we can deal with that with the Brown Act. We just need to identify and notice that community meeting as a city council meeting as well. And we'll define what the roles will be between what staff's role is and what they're doing, what the council role is. We can do it either way. But we want to check in and make sure, is that consistent where we want to have that process going forward, which is council members don't attend council community meetings that are created or prepared or managed by staff. And two, if there is a council desire, that we notice that as a regular council meeting, or special, actually it says a special council meeting. So that's where we've been. We want to see, is that where you guys are today, or do you want to revisit that?
The consensus of the council, Vice Mayor Warner.
I would suggest that if there's a community meeting, that we find out if there's more than 2 of us that want to show up, and then we could go through the extra effort to notice it.
Anybody else? Is that it? Okay, Councilmember Monroe. There we go. Okay.
Yeah, I rather like the idea of having more council participation at community meetings than less, provided it is, I'm sort of torn between the idea that we want to sort of stand back to let staff gather information and the idea that we want to be present to show willingness to engage, willingness and indeed desire to engage. And I'm wondering if those two things, I'm torn. I would like to see us be as engaged as possible, but also make sure that there's places where if our presence is going to be a distraction, we're not there. And I don't know how to make that distinction.
Well, and that's part of the problem is because when the council is there, it really changes the dynamic of a meeting. And it goes from more information gathering to a forum, a platform to state one's personal position. So it's not quite as cut and dried as gathering data. Councilmember Carling.
Yeah, I'm happy with what Vice Mayor Werner said. I think that would be a reasonable approach.
Okay.
As for me, I'm very happy with it. I don't want to do anything that's going to push the Brown Act. And, we understand ostensibly at this point, we know what the Brown Act covers and what it is. And I really don't want to push the boundaries too much. It's not ours to push, it's the state's.
Okay. And Vice Mayor Warner?
Yeah, I think that it's important that we don't overly influence the community meeting. I'm thinking about the, in science, if you go to measure something, you disturb it. But the example that came up in the past is when Council Member Spadowski and I wanted to go to a meeting and just to observe the the tone of it or how the community was doing. And that's something that's very difficult to see through a staff report in the aftermath than say a PowerPoint. So it was really to sense what was being said. And the idea at that time was just to hang back quietly and just observe. But that's very difficult. So that was the reason that this issue came up. And we were advised that it really wasn't helpful for us to be there, so we left. But I'm all for being able to observe. Now, the one advantage of these Zoom meetings, if we have them, coming in as just an observer and not even being clear that you're just somebody calling in, that's the kind of optimum way that you could observe what's going on without disturbing.
Okay.
So if I could sum up, Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
it sounds like there'd be a desire, obviously there is a desire to comply with the Brown Act. I think we all share that common goal. I think what I've heard is there's also a desire not to disturb the process, but what could be done in order to preserve both those goals is what I think Vice Mayor Warner has recommended, which is if we have a community meeting, staff can check in through the normal courses with a council member to see if there's any desire to participate or at least to attend. And then that would leave the decision making to individual council members and potentially collectively the council at a regular meeting to make the decision whether to notice it as a community meeting but as a city council meeting as well. And then we can define those parameters within that should you so choose. So I think the takeaway is the desire is to check in with you to see whether there's a desire to have a community meeting, to attend a community meeting. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, if I could just say real quickly, it's not to participate or observe. I think the point is to observe and not to be any part of the proceedings.
Yeah, of course, the
Fair
problem
enough.
is the problem is once you're at the proceedings, you become the meeting because all the focus then goes to you. But we can deal with that as the occasion arises.
Correct. We'll leave those dynamics for you as a collective council to consider the dynamics and whether your presence will unduly influence the proceeding, but we can at least have the check-in.
Okay, very good.
The second component for this item is with regard to the attendance of community meetings, a majority of the city council. So we will touch upon this later in our presentation, but just as a precursor or preview and a review for those who've been through my trainings in the past, there is an exception to the Brown Act's meeting requirements for a majority of the city council to attend a community meeting that is duly noticed. Again, this is not an AstroTurf type meeting. This is a meeting that's called by a organized group or somebody who's actually inviting the entire public to participate on a particular issue. In that situation, you as a city council can attend those meetings and you can actually engage in the discussion. Now, when I say you can engage in the discussion, you are then beginning to toe the line with the Brown Act. There is one basic theme that will apply to all those exemptions, which we'll discuss this later, which is you still cannot discuss amongst yourself items of business within the city council's jurisdiction. So you can't collectively go to a meeting that's hosted by somebody else and then sequester yourself off in a corner and start discussing city business. Not that you're doing that, but that's just an example of what the Brown Act would not allow. But if you were there to observe and participate in someone else's community meeting, you could. So I know we've been very respectful of the Brown Act in the past. I don't know if this is necessarily the forum to have that conversation, but I wanted to highlight this in case you did want to have a conversation, what those rules were. Again, community meeting called by somebody else, publicly noticed, the public could attend. Majority of you could attend and observe. You could participate in the discussions, but you'd have to be cognizant of, one, the appearance you're creating with the public that you're in front of. Two, you'd have to be very cognizant of not cross-talking with, say, the council member making one point and another council member seconding that particular point, because then again, you're getting into your council deliberation process. But I just want to highlight the distinction between that type of meeting and then a city meeting. I'm not sure if you have any questions now. We can discuss those or go through your expectations, or we can review that again once that comes up during the presentation.
Questions at this point? Doesn't look like it. Okay, carry on.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, Vice Mayor Warner.
I just want to draw the distinction. There can be community meetings on a particular topic of interest to the community, and there are several recent examples. And there can also be community meetings with respect to political activities, campaigns and such. There's a distinction there, right?
Correct. I'm not speaking to a campaign type situation. Campaigns are a separate discussion altogether. When you get into the political arena and campaigning for office or for and against a measure, that's private activity. I was speaking to your participation in your official capacity as a council member. So you're right, that's an important distinction to make. Thank you.
Okay.
So the next item on our first slide is dealing with the use of city letterhead. And let me tee up the hypothetical that is why this question is being presented to you today. There was the appearance in a local city here in the East Bay. A council member on city letterhead wrote a message to, I think it was the press, representing that they were taking a position on behalf of the entire city council. Well, at least it wasn't that clear whether they were or were not, but it created that impression by using city letterhead. But there's no action taken by the city council at a formal meeting. So it did a couple things. It created this appearance that there was some action taken by the city council that wasn't actually taken. Two, that they were speaking for the entire city. And in that particular conversation, it was weighing in on the China versus Taiwan divide. In the past, I have been asked by various council members, do you have the authority individually to use city letterhead for certain activities? What I'm asking for your guidance here today is there a spectrum where it would be okay and situations where it would not be okay? For example, if you're taking an official position by the city that would require compliance with the Brown Act and an action by the city council. So I think the answer would be, if that's the situation, that has to be approved by the city council at a regular noticed meeting, or at a noticed meeting. However, where are you relative to, let's say, a letter for recommendation that is more personal to the council member and not necessarily personal to the city council? That's a nuance we haven't discussed previously. Are you okay with a council member using letterhead for that purpose or not? So that's the question I want to put before you.
Councilmember Monroe.
So this actually did come up for me at one point, and Ms. Alcala and I discussed it, which might be why it's coming up now. I'm not sure. But the conclusion that I was very happy with was, if the letter of recommendation is with regard to something that would be within the role of city council. So somebody wants a recommendation for a job that is city related in some way. Financial, there's a financial position in some other city, and they want something along those lines. I don't know. But within a city, then in that case, my role might be relevant, in which case it seems like letterhead would be related. If somebody wants a recommendation for, college application or something along those lines, it seems like it wouldn't be. So it seemed to me like there was a distinction between when my role is relevant, in which case makes sense to me that's probably something we should allow, or whether the role is just tangential, in which case probably not.
Vice Mayor Warner.
Yeah, I'm thinking in that case that, you'd have to get it decided. Where I would opt to is if in the letter of recommendation, you thought the role of council member was pertinent, you could mention that in your qualifications for being one to provide an evaluation or letter of recommendation. So I would tend to go there. I'm thinking of another example of where, various of us are liaisons to different organizations within the city and other places. And sometimes we want to, in that role as the liaison or we want to communicate with that organization. I think in the past, I've always interpreted it would then be appropriate to have it come on the city letterhead. But I'm not, that's the way I interpret it. I just wanted to check, and is that right?
And I think something like that is appropriate. Now, I've written letters of recommendation for people that have worked for the city that I have worked with, and I provided recommendations for them. There have been grant applications, for example, where they've looked for a recommendation from the mayor to put into the recommendation into the packet for grant awards. So those sorts of things, because there's that tie-in with the city, I think that those have been appropriate. If it's, just trying to think of someplace, if it's someone's financial gain, for a bid contract, I don't know about that, since there'd be a conflict of interest. But I think for someone with which, another one example, the Livermore Area Youth Advisory Commission, there have been young folks that have served on the commission. We interviewed them. They've reported to the council, and they're looking for a recommendation for college. And I think in a circumstance like that, where they have worked with the city in a certain capacity, that a letter of recommendation on letterhead would be appropriate. Anybody else? Councilmember Monroe and Vice Mayor Warner. Councilmember Monroe.
Yeah, I appreciate what both you and Vice Mayor Warner just said. I don't have a particularly strong opinion on any of this, but I do think that what where this, somebody has worked for, has been an intern in the city, that's particularly, would be a nice place for it to have city letterhead. But there are other ways to make it happen, so it's not something I'd go to the mat for on.
Vice Mayor?
Yeah, so I think, given what's been said, there are instances where it's appropriate and perhaps where it's not. And we prevail on the city attorney to just say it's not a cut and dried one way or the other, but here's examples. And if there's any lack of clarity, we can, check in with the city attorney.
Okay. Yeah.
So thank you. With that direction, I'll proceed as follows. If you have a situation where you are interested in signing a letter of recommendation, I think we'll have that conversation and see how it comports with the Brown Act and whether you're taking a position or the subject would be something that would require an entire city council action at a meeting. What I will also do with this direction is I will prepare some language for your rules of procedure for the next time you have an opportunity to review those come next January, and see if I can put some more boards around that so to help you with this conversation. So thank you for that.
For example, I was asked to provide a letter of thanks. Somebody donated a sculpture to the city, and so I provided a thank you that was on city letterhead, since they made that donation to the city as part of our sculpture garden. Vice Mayor.
Sorry, I forgot to.
No worries. No worries. Just want to make sure we get everybody. Okay, on to interactions with staff.
So thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I'll cover these next two very briefly, interactions with staff and as far as advisory body interviews. Again, a couple things just to be cognizant of. Again, it takes the full council, or at least a majority of the council, to take an action. But when engaging with staff, even a side conversation can be interpreted to be direction. And again, the direction comes for the entire council. So just be aware of that in the chain of command and where you sit within that chain of command at the very top. And be circumspect when you're having conversations within the organization that may be perceived by staff as direction, which again, if it's consistent with the entire council direction, taken at a regular or a notice meeting, great. But if it's a nuance or a change, just be cognizant that may cause some not only challenges for the staff in complying and actually implementing the council's direction, but could also create the appearance that something happened in one forum, which is the proper noticed forum, that may be different when it's outside that forum. So just want to make sure you're aware of that. I think you all are. Just as a reminder. The second item here, the fifth item, is advisory body interviews. Again, you have a city council subcommittee, and we'll get to more subcommittee information in a moment. But with regard to that, it's up to that subcommittee to vet and evaluate the credentials and qualifications for a particular applicant. I want to deal with that particular item with regard to qualifications. Right now, that's solely a city council subcommittee analysis, which is consistent with the Brown Act. We have notice Brown Act meetings for that evaluation. Do you have a role for staff to play in that? Let me give you one example that I want to seek some direction from today. Some of the qualifications or requirements for an application require an applicant to have attended a meeting for the advisory body they're applying to be part of. Right now, staff doesn't necessarily weigh in on that particular qualification, whether they actually attended those noticed meetings. But would you like them to fill that role? In the past, the council set this expectation up, but didn't really have a tool with which to measure that expectation. So the question I want to put before you is, if you are going to require an applicant for an advisory body to attend a meeting of that body prior to applying or prior to being interviewed by city council, do you want to be in charge of making, or have the subcommittee be in charge of making that determination whether the applicant did or did not comply? Or are you looking to staff to make that confirmation?
Well, it is on the application whether they attended a meeting or not. So I guess they could lie, but that typically would come out during the interview. Councilmember Carling.
Yeah, I agree. It's on the application, and I guess I'm just willing to trust the person that they're telling us the truth. you're asking us, Jason, if we want some staff member to confirm that this person attended the meeting the way they have indicated they have? Is that what you're asking?
That's what I'm asking because that question has been asked of staff in the past,
I
asking
don't think
whether,
it's I don't think it's necessary, I guess.
okay.
Yeah, I agree. I think that staff's got enough to do without chasing some of the applicants. Councilmember Monroe.
I would agree with regard to that. However, at one point, one of the advisory body interview, one of the sets of interviews included some analysis by staff of various kinds of demographics, basically an analysis of the applications with regard to, I think, location in Livermore, it's some other stuff that all from the application. I found that very helpful in just sort of giving me a context for thinking about the application. So if that's the kind of thing you're talking about, I'm all for it.
So on that particular subject, Councilmember Monroe, that's a good question to bring up here. Again, you as a city council create a city council subcommittee to conduct these applicant interviews. Is it within your expectation that the subcommittee be in a position to direct staff to perform whatever additional analysis may be done to prepare information for the committee's consideration? Is that what I'm hearing? Is that you want the subcommittee to be able to give that direction to staff to determine what role they should or shouldn't?
Actually, in this case, it was just done, and it was very nice. But no, we didn't ask for it; it just appeared.
So I would, if you're looking at an example with regard to the Climate Action Plan Committee, that was direction from council, which was to make sure we had a diverse group. So there's additional information.
Actually, it wasn't that one, but anyway.
Okay.
But perhaps it should come from council in that case, not just from the subcommittee.
Councilmember Carling.
Again, I guess I don't think it's necessary. Otherwise, you're asking for a different qualification that is not on the form. So I'm not sure I understand what the value in that is. I mean, we have qualifications and we do the interviews, and why does it matter where they live, for example?
So I can speak to part of that question. The qualifications as far as residency will be established in your ordinances for a particular advisory body. So that's where we start with. But sometimes you can have people participate in an advisory body meetings that are not necessarily residents. So that's the first qualification. There's the qualifications that are set by ordinance, and then there's qualifications that you're looking for, or certain aspects you're looking for that aren't necessarily set forth in the ordinance, that just happen to be in the admin sphere. So what do I mean by that? The requirement to attend an applicant to attend a meeting of an advisory body prior to applying for that doesn't exist in an ordinance. That does not exist in a staff report. That what doesn't exist in a resolution. That's just been in part of this application. So that's been there. That's been the city's practices, but there's no council direction behind that. So what I'm trying to tease out here is, do you want to have more guidance from the city council so they can take that action to guide the actions of the city council subcommittee on advisory bodies? Or do you want to leave that to the subcommittee itself to define those parameters when preparing the applications?
I guess for me, it's the latter.
Vice Mayor Warner.
Given the fact that it's a sort of a permanent subcommittee of the council, but it rotates people, and it does every 6 months or so.
Yes.
I think having the subcommittee determine new rules every 6 months wouldn't make sense. I think it's the rules and the requests come from council direction, and then the subcommittee works within that. And then I don't think it's true that in some sense, it shouldn't matter where in the city you live, as long as you do live in the city. But on other cases, I can see where, let's just say asset management or something, the different parts of town have a different approach or experience. So maybe you would want some diversity of neighborhood there. I don't know, but I don't think we need to solve it here, because in my impression is over the years, we've done pretty well with that subcommittee and interviewing people for the committee. And commissions. So I would just leave it alone unless there's some action at the council that says we need to do something different.
All right.
So if that's the consensus of the council, I think that leads us into our next bullet point on this, our final bullet point for this particular slide, which is subcommittee formation. So far, the subcommittees have been created by the mayor and by the city council at regular city council meetings as appropriate. Again, the subcommittees can be either standing or ad hoc. Standing have continuing subject matter jurisdiction or appointed time, and basically those are the ones that are reflected either in your municipal code or that you've taken a very formal action to create. For example, your downtown outreach subcommittee, your asset management committee, your climate action plan committee. However, other subcommittees formed by the city council are only reflected in the minutes. They aren't followed up by a resolution. But I want to confirm that that is the appropriate touch, or if you want to have some further guidance, particularly with ad hocs. For ad hocs, they generally benefit from the following: something that defines one, what is their area of responsibility in the limited subject matter jurisdiction. Two, what is their duration? How long are they to be limited subject matter and limited duration? How long would they go for? Generally, it's less than a year, but I think having a formal sunset date would be helpful. And three, well, who does that subcommittee consist of? Those can be reflected in the minutes or resolution. I'm looking to see if you have a council expectation as far as what you'd like to see. Right now, we've know it when we see it. We think we have a sufficient level of duration and formality. We'll return with the resolution. Other times we've left it to the minutes, which is a bit looser. Do you have an expectation that you'd like to establish for all council subcommittees, or leave it with the status quo?
My personal feeling is, as we have felt the need to create a subcommittee, for example, with the downtown, we were able to do that, and especially by coming together and determining what exactly we needed for that subcommittee. So at this point, I wouldn't change the process. I think, from the council perspective, it's been working. We don't form that many committees that frequently. We just recently formed the Energy Committee and also the Asset Management. But I think the process is working quite well right now. Anybody else? I don't see any other hands raised.
Well, I agree with the mayor on this one myself. I think we've made a good use of the committees that we've mostly ad hoc there. I'm used to having being on boards or whatever that have standing finance and committees and things, but I don't think it's necessary. We get enough of a report on everything. We all get to hear it at the same time. We're all good.
Okay. Further comments?
Very good.
Looks like we're good. Okay.
So with that, Mr. Mayor, I will take the direction being that for ad hoc subcommittees, the standard expectation will be that they're of a duration of less than a year. And should staff need a bit more guidance to define what that subcommittee, who are the participants in that and their subject matter, we may ask additional follow-up questions when they're formed, but they'll just be reflected in the minutes. Sound appropriate?
Sounds good. Councilmember Monroe.
Yeah, so Councilmember Carling and I are part of the homelessness subcommittee, which is now in a year and a half in. So clearly we're not meeting we haven't solved homelessness in a year, so stunningly enough.
So it's not an ad hoc committee then.
I think wasn't that how it was established? Was it a standing?
Well, it's we haven't solved it in a year, so I guess
What I'm
by
wondering-
definition,
Yeah, so what I'm wondering is if we should, at the end of a year, come back and evaluate whether,
to reappoint.
well, not necessarily reappoint, I'm just thinking but also, do we need to reestablish the committee? You know,
Vice Mayor Warner?
have some process. If they're really only supposed to last for a year, then at the end of a year, can we come back and have a process whereby we sort of think about where this is going, where it's going, and reevaluate going forward?
Vice Mayor Warner?
I think that's a good point, that a topic like homelessness might take a long time, if ever, and that it's so that, and if we decide that we need a subcommittee on that topic, then we ought to be really more formal about it, I believe. And the other, as an example, maybe it isn't just homelessness, but if you had a permanent or a standing subcommittee, it could be on human services. But it gets along to where Councilmember Coomer mentioned, in some boards, they have standing subcommittees for topics that never go away, like finance. But this may be one that deserves more attention. So I think that we could come back maybe on some council meeting with an agenda item to talk about that one.
The pleasure of the council.
I think it's okay. I think regarding the homeless subcommittee, I do think we concluded within a year, Councilmember Monroe can correct me, but I do think we completed within a year the short-term elements that we were first focused on. And then we kind of, there was a little bit of a break, and then we started on the medium and then eventually long-term, but of course the pandemic reared its ugly head, and so it's thrown a monkey wrench into that. So, but I do think it's probably worthwhile, for the vice mayor's suggestion, is to think about that and formalize it in a different way.
And so, yes, I agree. We did get through one piece of it, but then we moved on to these next pieces. And so, yeah, so I'll be the third. Yes, I think we should take this forward and just have a process for, evaluating it's what, where, how.
Okay.
So, Mr. Mayor, with that direction from the City Council and their expectations, we will coordinate in the City Attorney's Office with Marie and the City Clerk's Office to evaluate which subcommittees are still active. If we have some that are at or near or look to exceed a year, we can return to the City Council to formalize those and make those standing committees, which will then trigger the requirements to comply with the Brown Act when they do get together, even though it is less than a majority of the City Council. But with that, we'll return to you to give you that option to formalize them and make them standing committees. So thank you for that.
Okay, very good. Okay,
Very good. So
next we go to Ethics and Public Service, AB 1234. Oh, Vice Mayor.
Just real quick, I think that on some of these subcommittees, like the one on the applicants for the commissions, and that we rotate through that, that's something where we're all interested. And it's really distinguishes the city, because in a lot of cities, they don't do it that way. They just give the mayor that responsibility. So I think it's good that we're all involved. I think we all care about these human services aspects. So if we set up a standing subcommittee, we could also have a process for rotating through it.
Okay. Right.
So, Mayor Warner, that is exactly what happens with your City Council Subcommittee on Advisory Bodies. So we can definitely use that model going forward. So thank you for that. We'll take that under advisement.
Okay, very good.
So, Mr. Mayor, I will now start the PowerPoint slide for the AB 1234 training. We've already engaged in a significant portion of that based upon our discussion here so far this evening. But now we'll get down into the actual nuts and bolts of what we're required to do. Let me see if I can get that to share. Very good. There we go. So we do have 2 hours. We're now an hour into it. We still need to go through this, so bear with me. I have 159 slides to go through. It's a bit daunting, but I think we'll clip through those rather quickly. With regard to council comments or questions, Mr. Mayor, how would you like to handle that? Do you want to use the hand raising, should that opportunity, or do you want just council members to jump in? Because I will have the PowerPoint presentation displayed, so you're going to see the big screen of the slides themselves.
My thinking is, I always like to have the questions asked at the end, because you see, keep that flow of the conversation going. And then as we get to the end, we can go back to those slides. But to me, it helps the flow a little bit better to ask the questions at the end.
Very good.
Yeah, don't see any vehement disagreement. So let's go ahead and take it away.
Very good, thank you. So again, this is your statutorily required training. Again, as we know, the city council members must receive 2 hours of ethics training every 2 years. This was adopted by AB. That's actually a typo there. I'm seeing it's not 1, 3, 2, 4. It's actually 1, 2, 3, 4. It was actually adopted in 2005. Just so the council and the public knows, we do plant typos and Easter eggs within our presentations just for the mayor to find those. We'll get to one of those in a minute.
Just
So
see if
that's
I'm
the
paying
first
attention.
The second one, again, overview, what are the required subjects for this training? You have to review personal financial gain, prerequisites, and that's not prerequisites, it's actually, as the mayor said, perquisites of office perks, governmental transparency, and fair processes. So the mayor gets a gold star for the overview. For our presentation today, it's organized into 5 separate sections: general ethical principles, government transparency, due process and fairness, financial conflicts of interest, and personal advantages and perks. So what will we review? This training will review both ethics laws, which are the legal requirements establishing what public officials must do, which is the floor, and ethical principles, principles guiding what the public officials should do, something to aspire to. Now, why do we go through this? Importantly, to 1, for good government, but 2, to avoid becoming a headline. We've all seen these. Bell, what happened down in the city of Bell, Antonio Villaraigosa fines for ethics violations in the city of Vernon. So unfortunately, there are headlines out there, and some cities have bad facts and make bad laws. I'm very proud of the city of Livermore and its response to the Brown Act, and we have consistently recommended that we avoid the appearance of impropriety, and I think that has served you as council members and the community as well, very well. So again, public expects local officials to act ethically and whether or not required to do so by the law. We all know the scene, which is, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And people say, I've never been convicted, been charged. That's not necessarily what the public expects of its elected officials. They expect them to lead by example and to earn the public's trust that they've been given and to respect that trust.
It's like Big Julie in the Guys and Dolls. 23 arrests, no convictions.
Exactly. That it makes for good TV. It makes for good movies because it's inappropriate. We all know that, and we actually want to be more respectful. And I thank you for doing that. Again, our first category: what are the general ethical principles? When faced with a difficult issue, take an ethical gut check. Ask yourself again: what's the floor? Is it legal? Does it comply with the city rules? What do we do? Is it consistent with your individual values? And if all that's still a little uncomfortable, how will it look with a headline? Will you be able to go to sleep at night thinking, did you do the right thing? Is this something you want to be remembered for? Is this something you believe in? There are ethical guides out there. There are publications. Each of these 3 do exist on the Institute for Law and Institute for Local Government's webpage: Ethics Laws Compliance, Best Practices Guide, What to Do When You Suspect an Ethics Problem, a local official's resource on ethics laws. I can provide you with links to all of these, and they do exist on the League of California Cities webpage, as well as the Institute for Local Government. Again, when faced with an ethical dilemma, you don't have to go through this alone. You can reach out and seek legal counsel. We can help you, but do remember that the city attorney represents the city. We can provide you with guidance as best as we can based upon the laws we interpret it and based upon both legal decisions and former opinions by the Fair Political Practices Commission. However, since the Fair Political Practices Commission, the FPPC, is the one who enforces these ethics laws, they and they alone are the ones that can give a letter based upon a set of facts to determine whether something is or is not compliant from their perspective. And since they're the enforcing body, we need to get the letter from them. And on occasion we have. It's a fairly straightforward process. We just need to outline what are the facts of the situation, where we think the conflict would be, and they'll give us a letter back saying it's okay, or they'll say, no, we do need to have the council members step back and not participate. So there's a very regular process established for that. Moving on to what the law says. So what do we have for government transparency? We're very familiar with a number of these laws. They're based upon the general rule of thumb, it's the people's business. Again, we exist within a fishbowl. We want to make sure the public sees the process that we're engaging in, and you're engaging in making decisions that will affect the community, and they have the ability to participate in that. Again, people want to avoid a situation such as Tammany Hall, where decisions are made in smoke-filled rooms behind the scenes. Thankfully, in our day and age, that doesn't generally happen, and does not happen here in Livermore. And one of the reasons being, with the advent of social media, if you want to get some information out there, you tell a phone, tell a friend, or tell a public employee. Eventually, it all gets out there. So what are the 4 primary transparency laws we need to be aware of? California Constitution, Brown Act, the first PRA, which is the Public Records Act, and the second PRA, the Political Reform Act, which in the Political Reform Act is what deals with your Form 700 economic interest disclosures. Now, with regard to the California Constitution, in November of 2004, the California Public Records Act and the Brown Act were codified as constitutional rights, that they have the right to access their documents and to participate and see the process. So we've been adhering to that prior to 2004, and we have been adhering to it since 2004 to make sure we do allow the public to have access to the city's records. The Brown Act, we've already been discussing this quite extensively this evening already, but what is the Brown Act? The Brown Act creates a rule that all meetings of a legislative body of a local agency shall be open and public unless an exception applies. Again, why do we have this rule in place? Because the conduct of the public's business in the open and give them the access to the city's decision-making creates confidence in government. The public trusts the process it can see. Now, what is a meeting? Meeting means any congregation of a majority of the city council members at the same time and place to hear, discuss, or deliberate upon an item within its jurisdiction. Again, that's a very broad law there. You can get together and hear something that could potentially lead into a Brown Act violation if not properly noticed. So we do need to be cognizant of what the rules are when you're in that role and what the exceptions are. So this includes any direct communication or the use of intermediaries or technology or serial meetings. Unusual examples that we've seen crop up in other cities throughout the state are retreats and site tours. Those are, again, noticed meetings. So if you were to visit, say you want to visit a new really cool public works process or water treatment, you would have to, and you want to go collectively as a council, you would have to notice that as a public meeting. And we've done that in situations where we've had the planning commissioners take a tour of certain facilities within the city, and the public was able to get on the bus and go along with them. So those are some of the things we've done to comply with the Brown Act. What are prohibited meetings? Meetings before a meeting, meetings after a meeting, meal gatherings before, during, or after a formal meeting, and seriatim meetings. So these are types of meetings that are not condoned by the Brown Act, particularly expressly when there's a majority of the city council members collectively gathering to hear, discuss, or deliberate on items within their subject matter jurisdiction. So you can't get together ahead of time, and you know this, to have a meeting before you get in the meeting. Seriatim meetings, what are those? Those are basically daisy chain sequential. A talks to B talks to C talks to D, and you're sharing decisions, where you think you're going to vote going forward. Again, another one is a hub and spoke. We have a common point of contact. A reaches out to B individually, C individually, D individually. Those, again, are ways that the Brown Act can be violated. We do need to be cognizant of that. Because how can those meetings occur? Basically, it's becoming easier and easier to step afoul of the Brown Act through the use of technology. Phones, faxes, emails. The reply all has been the bane of many legislative official. So we've strongly discouraged sending emails to you collectively that have all your email addresses, where you could inadvertently hit a reply all as opposed to reply to the staff member. So we encourage you to be cognizant of that and to watch out for that reply all. The last bullet point, social media. We had that conversation earlier today about what does it look like when you're out there as an individual? Are you there in your personal capacity? Are you there in your official capacity? If you're there in your official capacity, you need to make sure that your individual official capacity presences don't start having conversations in the electronic world that could lead to a collective concurrence. So with the direction you've given us, we'll return with some guidance on that. And again, human intermediaries can be used for seriatim meetings, so we need to be cognizant of that as well. What do meetings not include? Individual contacts. Conferences or similar gatherings open to the public. Social ceremonial occasions. Again, here's the general rule we discussed earlier. Provided a majority do not discuss among themselves city business. There is this caveat, other than as part of the scheduled program. So you can have that conversation, speak to the item before the floor at that community meeting or at that conference or that gathering. But again, when you start directing your comments and someone says, A says a statement, B then says, I support that, or C says, I agree, you're running afoul. So you need to watch this last rule whenever you're in these situations or within an exemption, that you don't collectively discuss amongst yourselves and don't use it as a proxy. That's our strong recommendation. This is what we talked about earlier this evening. Organized to address a topic of local community concern by a person or organization other than the local agency. Again, you can participate in those as long as you don't have a conversation amongst yourselves as part of that. You can comment, you can participate in that meeting, but you should be cognizant of trying to avoid a collective concurrence as well as the appearance of impropriety. Somebody somewhere will try to say you're doing something inappropriate, and again, even though it won't necessarily violate the law as a Brown Act violation, it could run afoul of the community expectations. So just please be cognizant of that when attending meetings organized with local community concern. Meeting does not include what we've come to know as wolf briefings. That's based upon the decision in the case of Wolf versus Fremont, that allows staff to provide information to city council members to inform them of what's happening in the city and allow the council members to ask questions of staff so they can be informed and prepared to make decisions when they ultimately make their way to you in a noticed council meeting. We have to be very cautious about this and make sure that no information is shared from council member to council member that would actually result in a seriatim or a daisy chain meeting. Again, once you get to majority, that would be a Brown Act violation. So your staff expends a great deal of effort to make sure you have very comprehensive staff reports before you at city council meetings. And we do meet with you regularly through wolf briefings to provide information to you and make sure that what will be presented to you has the information that you need to make a decision. But again, you'll hear us in these briefings not to share what your final outcome or your decision is going to be, and we make sure you don't share decisions or comments from one council member to another outside of those briefings. What are the requirements to conduct a lawful meeting? You have to have an agenda that briefly describes what's going to be discussed. It must be posted at least 72 hours before regular meetings and 24 hours prior to a special meeting. And we have to post it in an accessible location and on the city's web page. So those are the basic requirements. The agenda, the description of agenda matters is always a fun topic. I won't tell you which city I came across this, but I did have, through my travels, a staff member say, I don't want to provide a comprehensive description because if I do, the public's going to know what I'm going to talk about and they'll come down and talk to me. Exactly. we live in a fishbowl. It sounds funny, but those kind of conversations do occur in certain agencies throughout the state. We don't adhere to that policy. We want to make sure we have comprehensive descriptions to let the community know what we're working on and what decisions we'll be making at a meeting. So if anything, we actually put more information in our agenda than is required by law for that particular purpose, to make sure the public is definitely aware of what's transpiring. Again, it must be sufficiently clear and specific to alert the person of average intelligence and education that they may be affected by this. And we have to identify it as an action or discussion item. That's why you'll have items on there to adopt a resolution, adopt an ordinance, or to provide discussion and direction. So we adhere to that in our agendas. Again, the general rule is no action or discussion of matters not on the agenda. However, the Brown Act does have a certain amount of leniency that allows you as council members to briefly respond to public statements or questions, ask a question for clarification, say for something that's brought up during a citizens forum. You can make a brief announcement. You can make a brief report on his or her activities. We do that for you. We actually have a place on our agenda so you can do that. You can make a reference to a staff member to provide factual information. And you can also ask staff to briefly respond. And you've been very good about adhering to those and complying with the Brown Act in those limited exceptions. Other exceptions are commendations. We do that. We have a regular area on our agendas for proclamations. Sometimes they come up in an urgency matter or after an agenda's been published, so you can make commendations even if they're not posted on an agenda. You can request to place an item on agenda for a future meeting. That's your agenda building portion of your agenda. Limited direction to staff on ministerial items. And again, limited follow-up to the general public on their comments. This is generally what we have for our matters initiated and councilmember comments at the end of the agenda when you do your agenda building. You also have the opportunity to add items to an agenda after it has been published and your meeting commences. They're very limited. You have to determine that there's an emergency situation when you do that. However, you do have to have a two-thirds vote. Two-thirds must be present, and you need to have two-thirds vote to add that. It's under extraordinary circumstances. Livermore, thankfully, has not had to avail itself of this provision in the past. We actually had a conversation, I think it was about 2 years ago, whether there was actually an urgency to move forward on an item. The council found there wasn't, so it was not added, and we moved along. Other cities that I've represented in the past have found themselves in that situation where they were going to either have a significant loss of funding if they didn't act or approve a warrant, and they've needed to add those on there. I will say those have been smaller cities rather than cities of Livermore size. Again, an agenda must provide for comment. At a regular meeting, the public must be afforded the opportunity to comment on any item within the city's council's subject matter jurisdiction, as well as for each agenda item as it's called up. We're well versed in that, and you've done a very good job of, again, when a citizens forum, it's anything within the purview, and you advise the public of that, and that you can't take an action on that. You've also been very good about limiting the public comments to the items under discussion. So that way it's focused, it's speaking to the item, that way you can make sure you get your business done as a city council. Special meetings are slightly different. Special meetings are usually have limited items. On those ones, the public comment is limited to the agenda items. There's no opportunity for a citizens forum or any item within the council's subject matter jurisdiction, but rather limited to that particular agenda item, such as our workshop today. Dealing with public comment, again, in speakers' rights, and you've codified these in your rules of procedure. They have a right to equal time, right to comment anonymously should they so speak, and they have a right to criticize the city, the council, and advisory bodies and staff. We have had occasion where some public comments have been unduly critical or potentially offensive, but the Brown Act is very accommodating, and I've had the opportunity to have a conversation with the community to explain and narrate what was happening during certain situations. But again, it's important to recognize that the Brown Act does afford the public a great deal of latitude when making comments. Now, what are the limits you can place upon public comment? Again, you can limit the time for individual comments. You can limit the speaker to only one opportunity for each item. Again, you've done this, limit to the item under consideration. Direct comments to the city council, not to the public and not to other speakers. And council members are under no obligation to respond to questions should one be presented to them from the lectern or from the dais, to the dais during any particular council meeting. But again, the rules must be applied consistently. It must be applied equally to all speakers. That can present some challenges for the mayor and the vice mayor or whoever is conducting the meeting to maintain decorum. Again, the primary rule of thumb is that you're maintaining decorum in order to avoid disruptions. Now, how do we do that? You can do that through warnings. You can do that through recess or ordering a person removed. Again, these are escalating responses to control the meeting to make sure that you have the ability to get to your business, but also respecting the public's right to speak. These rules need to be applied consistently. An example we had, I will share with you from Livermore Planning Commission days, we had an individual who was off topic and was speaking and was becoming increasingly agitated and speaking about everything under the sun except for the item that was before the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission called for a recess, asked staff to speak with the particular person making the comments and see if they could focus their comments on the item before them. We as staff had that conversation, gave the individual, again, we reset their clock and gave them additional time, not more than the 3 minutes, but gave them another minute that had already expired to focus their comments. We came back from the recess. The applicant then, the speaker then focused their comments like a laser on the item before the commission, and all was good. So we do want to respect the right to public comment, but we also do need to respect the need to get the business done. So that's just one example of how the city has engaged and applied this particular standard in the past. With regard to, again, the agenda setting, we have the opportunity for closed session, but there's a very limited number of subjects within which we can go into closed session. Personnel matters, litigation, labor negotiations, when we're negotiating for real property, and if we have threats to buildings and facilities. The last bullet point, unfortunately, we had the opportunity or the necessity to use this past year when we had the cyber attack. But these are the limited bases within which we can go into closed session. And again, the code, the Brown Act established safe harbor language and they give us guidance how to describe these matters on the agenda. And we do follow those when preparing your agendas. Again, the closed session has a special agenda format. Public comment, the public is allowed to comment before the closed session begins. When we are in closed session, we need to stay on topic. We also need to limit attendance. So with that, we will have a very rigid comment portion of what we can discuss within closed session, and staff will guide you through to make sure your comments do stay within the agenda description, and we have admonished and we do give you that admonition before we start the closed session of what we're discussing here today, and we set those ground rules of what can and cannot be discussed. Limiting attendance is an interesting one. Again, we can go into closed session to talk about labor negotiations. We can talk about property acquisition. We can talk about litigation. You, however, are restrained by the Brown Act. You cannot invite in the other side. You cannot have a closed session conversation with a labor negotiator. You cannot have a closed session with the person you're actually going to buy the property from. So we have to limit the attendance to those who are necessary for the closed session, and we cannot bring in the other side. What are the consequences if you violate the Brown Act? Primary one is you lose the public trust. Public trust is hard to earn, but it's easily lost. So that's one thing that is universal that we can't protect against. So we need to be very, jealously protect the public trust. But what else? By statute, the action may be void. I say may because certain actions for Brown Act violation may be set aside. Other ones, they won't be set aside, but there will be penalties and repercussions to the side of that. You can get injunctive or declaratory relief against future violations. Also, you can be subject to attorney's fees if you receive a cease and desist letter and you fail to provide what's called an unconditional commitment to avoid violations. This last area has been a ripe area of litigation recently to determine what is the unconditional commitment to avoid violations. When does that attach? Thankfully, the legislature has responded to that and provided a safe harbor process where we have the ability to address this at a city council level prior to someone going and filing a formal action. They have to give us notice of an alleged violation. You have the ability to correct it, and you have the ability to make this unconditional commitment to avoid violations and therefore avoid the exposure to attorney's fees. Also, depending on what the action was taken, it could result, a Brown Act violation could result in a misdemeanor violation, particularly if the public was intentionally deprived of public information. Thankfully, that's rarely seen here in California, but on occasion, I think we know off our fingertips when those do tend to rise. Bell is still resonating throughout the state, and the fallout from that, that tainted, I think, every city, even those like Livermore who are good actors were still lumped in with the bad apples. Again, you want to avoid the violations such as this. Appellate court rules Merced County violated the Brown Act. This is actually an interesting case. This dealt with a CEQA case of all matters. There was a project that was being presented to the Merced County Board. However, the agenda description did not indicate that they were taking an action on a CEQA or an environmental document. And the court found that they had violated the Brown Act by not including that. That's why your staff reports right now have always contained the Brown Act information, but it's actually that much more prominent. So we don't run afoul of that particular decision. So before we move on to Public Records Act, any questions on what we've covered so far this evening? Very good.
Just
Seeing-
one quick point. When you're talking about the ethics and the gut check, one of the ones that I always helped me with decisions was what I've heard referred to as the 60 minutes test. And that's imagine what happens when Mike Douglas comes into your office with the 60 Minutes film crew and asks you, so what's been happening here? That sort of helps with the decision.
That does. That is a good gut check to figure out. Mine is, would I be proud of the decision? Would I be comfortable if someone were to call the question? Would I be able to look my wife and my children in the eyes and hold my head up?
Both
But yeah, the Mike Wallace and the 60 Minutes showing up, that's a, definitely want to avoid that.
the 60-minute test.
Yes. So our next subject matter for government transparency is the Public Records Act. So again, what is the rule? The rule is records maintained by...
I have a question. I had my hand raised
Yes.
there on the other section. So on the Wolf briefings, those are the 2, 2, and 1s that we go through?
That's what we've called them, yes. They have to be less than a majority of the city council, correct?
Right. You've also said that we can't discuss the content of that outside of those meetings with another council member. What about the council member we might have been in the meeting with?
Again, the Brown Act allows two to have a conversation. So as long as, think of this like your COVID social bubble. As long as it's contained within that group and it doesn't exceed those two.
I wanted to clarify that with the Wolf briefing, if we're parsed into 2, 2, and 1, you don't want to go with the side of that grouping.
That is correct. That is correct. You need to stay within that social bubble, that less than a majority bubble. So in that situation,
I'm just,
two council.
go ahead.
Councilmember Monroe, you had a question?
No, I was just like, the fact that we are now using COVID as an analogy says a little bit about where we are. That's all.
I tend to use pop culture references, and yes, COVID has definitely creeped into that. But with regard to the Wolf briefings, correct. If two council members are receiving a briefing, it is incumbent upon them not to communicate anything else on that subject with any other council member. So they are within that social bubble. Very good. Thank you. Good point. Returning to Government Transparency and Public Records Act, again, any records maintained by the city in the ordinary course of business are open to public inspection unless there is a specific exception that applies. Again, to ensure the public has access to info concerning the conduct of the people's business. And this is a common thing. We need to be cognizant that this is the people's business. We do their work. They get a chance to look and see what we're doing. A public record is broadly defined as any writing containing information relating to the conduct of the public's business, regardless of the physical form. In the past, we knew what a record was. It was a letter, it was a memo, it was a staff report. But the advent of electronic communications mean it can take various forms. We'll discuss those in a little bit in a few minutes. But what are the common exceptions to the Brown Act? Again, preliminary drafts that are not ordinarily retained in the ordinary course of business. Deliberative process privileges, basically your mental privileges. personnel, medical or similar files, attorney-client privilege, and catch-all, the public interest balancing test. With regard to the attorney-client privilege, we do work with our staff and let them know the attorney-client communication privilege doesn't attach simply by CCing your attorney. No, we need to actually be having a conversation with us on an area of law that we're asking for interpretation of law. It's not simply enough to protect something and make an exception by CCing your attorney. So staff's well aware of that. Again, when a request is made, it must specify a particular record or category of records being sought. And again, the request does not need to be written. The city's response to that, the city, by pursuant to the Public Records Act, must provide a written response within 10 days. Whether it has records that it will produce, and if it has records that is going to withhold due to an exception, we have to identify what that exception is. If we can't make that analysis within the initial 10 days, we can request a 14-day extension, but at the end of the 14-day extension, we need to provide that written response. The city also has a duty to assist a requester make a clear request, and particularly if they're asking for something that's not quite doesn't lead to a record that we're aware of, we can work with them to help focus that request, particularly when it's an open-ended request. We can identify types of records that exist, and we can direct the requester to other departments. Sometimes people are requesting a record from the city that may be actually withheld by the county or the park district, so we will help direct the requester to the appropriate source. Now, we have a duty to conduct a reasonable search. Again, this is a matter of degree. We don't have to search for a needle in the haystack, but we are required to keep our records orderly so we can facilitate a research. And that's part of our records retention schedule and part of the city clerk's work as a records official with city staff to make sure they are organized in a way that we can actually search them in a rather expedient manner. What do we not have a duty to do? We don't have an obligation to respond to written interrogatories. If someone asks for a document or asks for information and it's contained within a document, we can produce that particular document. We're not required to answer a list of questions like you would, say, in civil discovery. We're also not required to create a record that doesn't exist. If the information exists, we can produce it in that form. We do have the opportunity to synthesize information. We have done that on occasion, but the public doesn't have the right to ask us to prepare a record. And why is that? Because if it were otherwise, a member could say, prepare me a report similar to a staff report or an internal memorandum that discusses the following. And that's using resources, public resources for personal means, so that's why that particular rule exists. Also, we are required to maintain our records, and we do have a regular destruction process that we follow consistent with the government code. If a record is destroyed through that process, there's no obligation for the city to recreate that particular record. Again, we're required to produce non-privileged public records for inspection or copying without unreasonable delay. They may be produced on a rolling basis, and we can, if we're going to charge fees for copying or making reproductions, we have to advise the requester what those will be. Again, some requests are rather broad, and the city clerk has a new portal, a public records request portal, where we can provide documents as they become available, particularly for those that are more comprehensive, that requires us to gather documents from various places throughout the city to review them, redact information that may be privileged, and then produce the remainder of the documents. But the city clerk has a new public records portal to allow that process to occur, and we can produce the documents that are available as they become available. Again, for withholding public records, what must the city do? One, it must identify in writing the legal justification for withholding a document. Two, the name of the person making that determination. Three, and that person's title. Generally, if a document is going to be withheld, the city attorney's office partners with the staff member to determine whether privilege is appropriate. And if it's going to be asserted, we generally provide a memorandum from the city attorney's office with our names and our titles on there asserting the legal privilege to withhold a document. Again, what is the goal? We want to make sure that we don't violate the Brown Act. In the Public Records Act as well, with regard to the Public Records Act, I'm presenting to you a headline from LA that says the LA planners hid environmental reports and violated the Brown Act as a result of that. This is an interesting situation, and we have clarification in the law now. The issue was, as an applicant's project is being processed by the city, are they in separate roles or are they on the same side for a project? For example, the city has a duty to engage and make sure a project is evaluated consistent with CEQA. In that situation, they're not adversarial, but the city has a regulatory role. In order to have that regulatory role, it is in not in opposition, but separate from the applicant. So in those situations, any communications between the applicant and the city are public records. So those can be produced based upon the case that led to this particular headline. However, once a project is approved and the city has taken its actions to approve or deny a project, it can enter into a common interest and joint defense agreement should an applicant challenge or want to overturn a particular decision. In that case, the law does allow the city to align its interests with an applicant who is the real party in interest, should it so choose. The Public Records Act and personal devices. This is a continuing area of law, well, an area of law that continues to evolve, I should say. Most recently, in the City of San Jose versus Smith, the California Supreme Court clarified that it's not necessarily the means with which a communication was made, but rather the substance of the communication. And this, again, dovetails to the Facebook page example I mentioned earlier, which is if Facebook is used as a vehicle to communicate with the public in an official capacity on city business, that means it becomes a public record. And that means the city's obligations to retain that record and maintain it consistent with its retention schedule attaches. So in Smith, so if a communication is done by text or by email, excuse me 1 minute. It is the substance of that communication that is the public record, not necessarily the vehicle with which it was transferred. So the prior law was unclear on this. San Jose made that clear, and so we need to adhere to that. Our recommendation for the City Council is when you're communicating with the public in your official capacity, to use your official email, not to use your personal email. Keep your private life private and your public life public. So we're making sure that you use your official city email address, and we've extended that to some of our committees. We've asked the planning commissioners and in your downtown outreach subcommittee, we recommended that they get special email addresses solely for their capacity in that role. So if there's a public records request, we knew where to look and make sure we keep those worlds separate. So with that, do you have any questions relative to the Public Records Act before we move on to the Political Reform Act?
Any questions? I don't see any hands. Okay, move on.
Very good, thank you. So the other PRA is the Political Reform Act. This deals with your financial conflicts of interest, when you need to recuse yourself from participating in a matter, and this is the source of your Form 700 electronic interest disclosure statements. So what is economic disclosure? Political Reform Act requires public officials, candidates, and employees to disclose financial interests to avoid conflicts of interest by making their financial interest publicly available. Again, the public gets to know what are sources of income so they can determine and observe those situations where those areas may influence decision maker. They may be participating before you. What is the rule? Upon taking office or leaving office, and annually, an official must fill out these forms and disclose any source of income over $500, your investments, your real property interest that does not include your personal residence, your business positions, as well as any source of gifts over $50. If you receive a gift basket that says $51, it needs to be listed in your Form 700 unless there is an exception. Now, there are exceptions to anything, so any legal rules. So what are some of the exceptions? Any benefit of which the official does not provide goods or services equal a value, that's a gift. So if I do something and for $50 and I get a $100 response, well, that additional $50 is disclosable. A gift can include money, goods, services, any type of activity, meals, tickets, we'll get into that in a moment, rebates, discounts, and travel. And we'll definitely get into that last one, travel, in a moment. A gift is received when you take possession or exercise control over it, and that includes discarding or regifting. So even if you receive it, if you pass it on, you're still being charged with having received that particular gift. Now, what are exceptions? Reciprocal gifts between friends, your BFF. They actually, the FPPC use that terminology, that your best friend forever. If you're having a social occasion and you regularly have a meal or you treat someone to dinner and they reciprocate, that's fine. Bona fide prize winnings. Weddings or similar party favors, bereavement gifts, neighborly gestures. Those are exceptions to gifts. If you receive those are fine. Again, this last one is very important. Beware of anything from a lobbyist. Those gifts comes with strings, so if any lobbyist, and they're supposed to register with the, California, with the state, offers you a gift, my recommendation is consider long and hard before you receive that, because additional rules apply. My recommendation is that you will generally be that you return that gift. Now you need to watch out for indirect gifts given to a family member, because those gifts will be accrued to you. So if my in Form 700, Form 700 world, if my wife receives a gift that is given to her, I have to be cognizant, is that a gift to me? So watch out that the financial interest, her financial interests are my financial interests, because we are in a community property state. Now, what are your options if you receive a gift over $50? First question is, do you want to keep it, or do you want to report on your Form 700? If you want to keep it, that's fine. Report on your 700 as long as it's not over $500. If you don't want to keep it, you can either reimburse the donor for the fair market value, you can return the gift unused, or donate the gift to charity. So that's something you can do. You can redirect the gift to charity, but again, this last provision attaches you can't take a tax deduction for that, because again, if you did, you've taken the benefit of that particular gift. So be aware of those rules. What happens if you get a gift over $500? The law is clear. You have a duty to reject it. If it's over $500, either in one gift or cumulatively over $500, you need to give those gifts back. Or you can buy down the value. Again, you can reduce the value of what you're paying. So if you get a ticket for an event, that's the only thing you've got from that particular person for the year, and it's $600, and you want to accept that, you have to pay that $100 difference and disclose the $500 gift on your Form 700. Now, gifts to the city. There's another way gifts do tend to find their way to the city. Rather than going to a particular council member, the gift can be made to the city, and the city can then disseminate that to you as elected officials or to the employees, but the city must administratively control the gift, and if it does that and reports it on the Form 801, that gift can then accrue to a council member or a staff member, and they don't need to identify that in their Form 700. Again, it's a different area of transparency. The city would use a Form 801 and let council and staff know, hey, we have received tickets for a particular event on a first come, first served basis. Would you like to come participate? And then they could step forward and participate in that. But again, for transparency, you complete the Form 801, and that's posted on the city's webpage. Rules regarding free tickets. Some are not reportable, again, when you're given to perform an official ceremonial role, or when they're not used by the official or anyone else. So if a gift comes in for you to attend a meeting and you're going to make a presentation, that's not a gift, that's official business. When are they reportable? Again, if you're given a ticket to an event where you have no ceremonial role, you have no official role there, that will be treated as a particular gift. Now, this is a well-known example of this. Antonio Villaraigosa, the mayor of Los Angeles, would regularly receive tickets to sit courtside at different sporting events. This particular one, I believe, was a Lakers game. He had no ceremonial role in that particular event. He showed up as the mayor. His response was, well, I'm representing the city, and it's good for the city to show up and support the LA Lakers. I don't disagree with that. But if you don't have a ceremonial role, that's a gift, and it needs to be disclosed in your Form 700. And if you've ever tried to get courtside tickets for the LA Lakers, they're probably not as easy to get as some teams, but they are still very, very expensive. So definitely more than $500, and that's a headline we want to avoid. What are some gift exceptions? Items of nominal value. you receive a pen, a pen, something like that, a notebook. Those are nominal value. Money received and donated to the agency, general fund within 30 days. Again, if you receive something and want to pass it through to the city, you can do that, document it, and you don't have to disclose it. Money donated to a bona fide charitable or other tax-exempt organization. So those are gift exceptions. There's a rule against honorariums. Again, you can receive access to a meeting where you have a ceremonial role or going to make a presentation, but you cannot receive a payment solely for the privilege of you showing up. So, for example, if I were to give a presentation to the League of California Cities, they could pay my admission to the event to participate in the training ceremony. They could pay for my hotel room and my travel, but they couldn't give me a payment for the privilege of making the speech. This is something we do need to be aware of, and actually one of our council members, Councilmember Coomer, and I've had a number of conversations with this. What is the distinction between an honorarium in official capacity and your personal capacity? Councilmember Coomer is also known as Four-Wheel Bob. If he receives a payment relative to his capacity and his personal capacity as Four-Wheel Bob, that's not an honorarium, and this rule doesn't attach. If they were to make a similar honor payment to Councilmember Coomer to say, I want you to appear as Councilmember Coomer, and I'm going to pay you this sum, that would trigger these prohibitions. So if you ever encounter yourselves in these situations, do reach out to us, and we'll walk you through the finer nuances of the particular rules. Behested payments, this is a new development, and I say new within the past 10 years, which is where a council member directs or fundraises for a nonprofit, and rather than giving the money to that council member, say, don't give me the money, rather I'd like you to send this money to this nonprofit or that nonprofit. If it's over $5,000 or more, you have to fill out different forms as an 803. That has to be filled out by the official who has solicited that payment and directed it to a particular nonprofit. This was something that was done when I was in Southern California prior to this rule. Council members who were very secure in their seats would have their campaign fundraisers, but rather than asking money given to them for their campaigns, they would ask them to be given to their favorite nonprofits. This rule addresses that, particularly if it's over $5,000. Payments considered behested if it's subject to reporting. Again, it's made at the request, suggestion, solicitation with a public official, and it does not qualify as a gift or contribution. So if you find yourselves in that situation, we'll have a conversation on how best to record that. In summation, give summary, disclose if it's $50 or more. If you're directed to refuse it by the Political Reform Act if it's more than $500 either in any single gift or cumulatively from a single source in any given year. And again, it is in a calendar year. It's not from year to year. So it's a calendar year to make tracking easier. What are the consequences if you accept gifts? Again, you need to disclose in your Form 700. What happens if you accept it but don't properly disclose? Again, criminal or civil sanctions, administrative fines and penalties, potential disqualification for participation, and again, loss of public trust. Again, we have another headline to avoid. Again, someone was fined $400 for failure to provide their economic interest statements on time. We do have our city clerk who is responsible for administering these forms, and you will receive notices if you are late, and we do encourage you to file these on time. She is charged by the state of California to issue fines, and again, this is not something I think the public expects. We are required to disclose this. We are required to be transparent, so it doesn't behoove us to find these type of headlines where we aren't complying, we aren't releasing this information and making ourselves transparent to the public. In summary, with governmental transparency, remember, it's the public's business. The public has the right to know and participate. We conduct our meetings in public, following an agenda. We allow inspection of our public records. It's always wise to assume that all information is or will become public, and that we must disclose our economic interests. And with that, that finishes that section. If there are any questions, I can field those now, or otherwise we'll transition to the due process and fairness component.
Questions? I don't see any hands. Okay.
Very good. So due process and fairness is inherent in everything that we do as a governmental body. What are the components of due process and fairness? Unbiased decision making. It finds its genesis in the common law as well as the statutory law. It also involves procedural due process, and it may affect us in holding office. What is unbiased decision making? There are several types of impermissible bias. One, a personal interest in the outcome, which is I am acting on something that's going to benefit me personally. It's hard to be unbiased if you have a stake in the outcome. Bias or loyalty to individuals involved. Again, if you believe that you have a relationship with an applicant that is very close, that may affect your ability to make a decision based upon the merits of what's before you rather than who the person is, you're required to step back and not participate. Again, there's also the third bullet point, informational bias, which is due to receipt of information outside of a public hearing, I should say of a public hearing. So you should be making a decision in your role as a council member based on the information that's presented to you. If you have information that you have received outside of that forum, we do strongly recommend that you do elucidate that and read it into the record and share not only with the record what's influencing your decision-making process, but also to allow your fellow council members to benefit from that information. It may be helpful for them when making a decision as well. So we want to make sure that you don't engage in unbiased decision-making based on information that's not in the room with you. And if it's not, definitely bring it into the room. Again, the public expects that decision makers will be impartial and avoid favoritism. What is fairness? Fairness is to use the information before you when making a decision, uphold rules and honor legal requirements, apply policies consistently, make decisions on merit-based reason, and consider all sides of information before making a decision. So that's what's inherent in fairness. And essentially, you want to make sure you keep an open mind when coming into a decision-making process. And it's also important to not become what the law terms as embroiled in the controversy. That term of art arose as a result of a planning commissioner who made a public statement to the press and was very vocal in the community that they were against a particular project that was finding its way before that individual as a planning commissioner. Well, the applicant took issue with that, saying, I have not even submitted my application to you. I have not had my opportunity to present the staff's report to you or to talk about my project in a public forum at a meeting, and so you have prejudged my application and you're biased against me. In that case, the court did find the planning commissioner was biased against the decision and made the planning commission retake that decision without that planning commissioner present because they were biased and unduly influenced the process and did not have an open mind. So on occasion, we will ask you you may have been invited to a conversation, whether willingly or unwillingly, and may have made certain comments in the press or in public that someone may be trying to use against you to say you have you are biased and you can't keep an open mind. We will work with you to see, one, is that true? Is your mind made up before it gets into the council chambers? Or two, is there ability to rehabilitate, to explain, no, you had comments, but you can keep an open mind and hear the evidence before you. There is a long line of cases that find that to be appropriate for judges in the judiciary system, and so we bring those lessons to bear upon your role as city council members. So again, what are the sources? The common law. What is the common law? That's the law that is derived from decision-making process and consistent application. The general rule is that a public officer is impliedly bound to exercise the powers conferred upon him or her with disinterested skill, zeal, and diligence, and primarily for the benefit of the public. This rule you'll find this rule in almost every single state in the United States. There's going to be at least one decision that refers to this rule that was derived from the common law, which is you're here to do the public's business, not your own. You're to do it diligently and to be engaged. So this has been around in just case law since 1920s, but is basically developed in the common law. Again, why? Because public officials owe an undivided duty of loyalty to the public. When a duty of loyalty to a private interest interferes with the duty of loyalty to the official must avoid participating in the decision. So if you can't adhere to this, or you find yourself divided in loyalty, the rule is to step back. Again, so that's your common law. Now, what is procedural due process? Procedural due process is derived from the U.S. Constitution, which is there'll be no deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process. Due process requires notice, an opportunity to be heard, and as we mentioned previously, an impartial decision. Due process is required when the city exercises its police power. The factors used to develop a fair process: the nature of the private interest at stake, the opportunity for error, to provide affected individuals with an opportunity to respond, and the government interest at stake. Now, again, the due process rights are designed to address the right at issue. Some will have a much more comprehensive and robust review process. Some will have a much more abbreviated administrative due process. Again, it's all key to what are the interests at stake. Also, as part of fair processes, it's incumbent upon the City Council to remain engaged, again with disinterested zeal, and to listen to the applicants and the information before them. There's a decision in the City of Los Angeles involving Diamond, who was proposing, of all things, a strip club to the City Council, and the City Council basically was disinterested. They knew that it was inconsistent with the zoning. They knew it was inconsistent with prior practices. That being said, the City Council didn't participate and listen attentively to the staff's presentation or to the applicant. The applicant filmed the council chambers, presented that as its first bit of evidence, showing that the council did not give him due process by listening to his case, and the council was required to remake that decision. The court agreed that the council didn't pay attention and wasn't listening to the application, giving him due process. The conclusion was ultimately the same, but he prevailed in court and had the council do a do-over and to pay his attorney's fees. So definitely engage and be respectful for due process and remaining engaged when you have a project or an applicant before you. Again, sometimes you have an adjudicative role, and you're making adjudicative decisions where you're acting more like a judge receiving evidence, applying rules. Generally, those come up with permit decisions and land use decisions. And those procedural due process, again, become that much more rigorous. What are your duties? We discussed a minute ago. Listen carefully to the evidence. Base decisions solely upon the evidence. Avoid ex parte communications. Those are conversations with an applicant or others, either for or against a project outside of the hearing forum. To apply the applicable rules. Give parties reasonable opportunity to present, as well as an opportunity to respond to information presented for and against them. And again, if you have a bias, either due to relationship or you're embroiled in the controversy, or you don't believe you can make a decision, the direction from procedural due process is to recuse yourself from that particular participation. Now, what are the remedies if you violate due process? Generally, it'll void the decision. You have to redo, as we discussed. Again, depending on what rights are at stake, civil or criminal remedies may apply, and particularly if there are other considerations involved. What are those other considerations? Obviously, if a decision is made upon someone's suspect classification, I didn't want to accept this application because this person was X. If those situations arise, that's clearly a violation of due process. That's not equal treatment under the law and will be dealt with very aggressively by any court of law, whether it's state or federal. Thankfully, we are seeing less and less of that nowadays. Okay, due process with regard to holding office. Now, how does holding office deal with fair due process and fairness? Essentially, bribery. There's a prohibition against bribery. We know that. You don't get to this for that. You don't get to take personal benefits to influence your decision-making process. The AB 1234 statute requires us to cover bribery specifically, and we all know what it is. No officer or employee can ask for, receive, or agree to receive any bribe upon an agreement or understanding that they will take a particular action in their official capacity or on any pending or future matter. This has made our headlines very recently in the Bay Area. If we're watching what's transpiring in the city of San Francisco, and the allegations that a public works director had encouraged applicants to provide financial contributions to council members and airport commissioners, as well as to for a business and a restaurant. Very uncomely, very unbecoming activities, and runs afoul of this particular prohibition, and is a deprivation of honest services. Now, what happens? You never want to have this as your headline, where a council member was actually accused and charged with taking a $2.3 million bribe for a particular project. Don't do that. You don't want this to be your headline. You don't want this to be your legacy. Again, with regard to holding office, there is the incompatible offices rule. So this is a very rigid rule in the government code which says an official cannot hold two public offices simultaneously if there's any potential conflict or overlap in their responsibilities. For example, a city council member cannot also be on the school board at the same time. Now, what happens if a council member were to run for the school board and be elected? The official will be deemed to have forfeited the first office. So the law provides a very clear remedy that if you do have are holding two public offices, the most recent one is the one you get to hold. The prior one is vacated. So that's a very rigid rule to be aware of. Slightly similar but slightly different is incompatible activities. Oops, sorry. Incompatible activities rule, which is it's not an office, but again, you're engaging in employment activity or enterprise for compensation that's inconsistent or incompatible with your role as an elected official or as your role as an employee. This has broader application. It's important for us to be aware of it, that even though you might not automatically be disqualified because it's not a competing office, but if the activities are competing, again, you may be required to recuse yourself, but you won't necessarily forfeit your office. All right. So moving on, if there are no questions, we'll move on to financial conflicts of interest in those four categories. Let's see. Don't believe I see any questions. Very good. So moving right along. For financial conflicts of interest, there's a general rule that no public official shall make, participate in making, or any way attempt to use his or her official position in a government to influence a governmental decision that he or she knows or has reason to know that there is a financial interest. So you can't approve a agreement or any item that will benefit you personally. What are the areas of financial conflict of interest? The four primary ones being employment, competitive bidding, contracts, and the Political Reform Act. We'll get back to that and again, return to what we just talked about previously. First, dealing with employment, there is what the state legislature has adopted as a revolving door rule. Certain officials cannot appear before their former agency for 1 year. What does that mean? You can't act as a compensated agent or attorney for someone else back before the city council. So if a council member were to term out or resign or no longer be a council member, they would be out for 1 year before they could come back and advocate before the city council again. So that's a pretty straightforward rule. The future employment rule, this was derived from a series of bad facts that occurred in Orange County and again in San Diego County, where a councilor was participating in an official project in their role as a council to review an application, but they were also offered an employment opportunity as a part of that conversation. They didn't take that opportunity until afterwards, but again, that would be a violation of financial conflict of interest to use your official position for a job now or in the future. We have, I've used the Irvine example in certain trainings I've done for the planning commissioners in the past to avoid job offers that applicants may extend when you're meeting with them in the field or as a result of reviewing a project, to stay well back from that line, to identify when that's happening, to call attention to it, and to avoid it. One that's pretty clear to us, an anti-nepotism rule. You have an interest in your spouse or child's income, particularly when the child still resides within your household. Want to make sure, why is there an anti-nepotism rule? To ensure everyone has access to governmental benefits and approvals. And this essentially for city employees is covered in our city personnel rules and regulations. This was something that I had exposure to in one of my cities I represented in Southern California. During a council meeting, one of the speakers at the lectern was chastising the council for engaging in nepotism, and then called out the camera operator for that particular meeting as being the cousin of one of the council members. That was unknown to staff. That was unknown to, I think, the company that was employing the particular cameraman as an operator, but it did become grist for the mill in the political arena. So it's always important to know that there is a prohibition against that, and to know that it could be called to the public's attention in a very uncomfortable way. Similarly, here's another headline: nephew of a top housing official in Richmond doubles salary through overtime and perks. Again, there's a number of things to unpack there, violation of rules, but for the nepotism, again, this is the nephew, how that gets injected into the headlines. Again, with regard to financial conflicts of interest and competitive bidding, we're required to review competitive bidding for public contracts. The Public Contract Code requires a competitive process for contracts to be awarded for public projects. If it's over $5,000, we're aware of that. We must accept a low bid. If the city has a process to award a contract, it must follow it. And it says commissioners may not interfere with the competitive process, but again, that's any official may not interfere with the competitive process. We have for public projects, the Public Contract Code applies, as well as the CUPCA, which is the California Uniform Public Construction Cost Accounting Act. For other purchases, our purchasing manual and our purchasing ordinances apply. Why do those exist? Again, to protect against fraud, corruption, and favoritism, to ensure honest bidders participate in the process, as well as to get the best deal for the agency's money. Again, the public projects, they have the Public Contract Code and the Uniform CUPCA. And again, for purchasing goods, materials, and services, we look at our local ordinance and our manual. Again, financial conflicts of interest in contracts. Rule of public officials are absolutely prohibited from having a financial interest in a contract made by them, and the last part's important, or their board. This prohibits self-dealing. Now, again, 1090, this is what we call a 1090 situation. Public officials, which are virtually all agency board members, officers, employees, the financial interest can be an increase or a decrease, and it's absolutely prohibited. In one situation, there were situations where I'm aware of where, not in this city, but in another city, again, and I will not name names, but a cleaning contract was coming before the city council for approval for janitorial services. Well, the company was owned by a council member. Again, if that council member were to participate in that decision-making process, that would be giving public money, directing public money to themselves in their private capacity. That's prohibited by the Political Reform Act as well as Government Code 1090. But actually it goes a bit further than that. Since that particular council member was involved in that particular contract, the entire council was prohibited from participating at that point. Because if they were to approve that contract, it would be a financial benefit unique and individual and personal to that council member. So in that situation, the entire city council was disqualified from participating in the matter, and that contract could not go forward. I will not share with you the outcome of what actually transpired on that one, but again, it's a word of caution to, if you have a personal business, it's best to keep that business separate from the city and not engage in city contracting. Now, how do you avoid 1090 conflicts? Know your financial interests. Know where your income comes from, and know what causes expenditures out of your pocket. So you're aware of those arising. So if you do have a financial interest in the business, we'll get to that in a minute with the FPPC and the again, economic interest disclosures. know where your money comes from. And that way, if a business comes up that you have an interest in, you know, is that something you need to recuse yourself from, or it could have potentially disqualified the entire city council. Again, consult your city attorney if you believe you have a conflict, and we'll work through that with you. To a certain extent, we may be able to guide you and potentially get an opinion letter from the FPPC, but at least to understand your financial interests and figure out, do we have a question to wrestle with? And again, using the examples that I provided, recognize that recusing yourself may not resolve the conflict. Using the example that if the contract is specific to you, the rest of the council members would be disqualified from participating as well. So what is a financial interest in a contract? That's not well defined in the law, unfortunately, but it's broadly construed. This is an example of how the court dealt with that particular issue, which was, however devious and winding the chain may be, which connects the officer with the forbidden contract, if it can be followed and the connection made, the contract is void. So it'll void the contract, and it can potentially expose the decision-making process as well as the participating council member to financial penalties as well. You can see by the court's choice of words where it's leading. When it uses the words devious and winding, it's has a little cynical approach here, which is, again, avoid the appearance of propriety, play it straight with the public, and avoid conflicts of interest, and you should be well back from this particular line. Now, what are the steps in making a contract? Planning for it, preliminary discussions to scope it out, negotiations to come up with the specific terms and conditions, and the last step is approving the actual agreement. If you have a financial interest, you're directed to not participate in any one of these 4 steps. There have been accusations by council members recently that they did not. A council member in a local city recognized that she had a conflict of interest and couldn't participate in making the contract because that was with somebody who she received income from. She wasn't the one who was engaged in the contract itself. It wasn't an agreement, but the applicant where she derived her income from was. In that situation, the city council member made the wise decision to recuse herself from participating formally at the agreement approval stage. However, there's a little less foresight because there's participation in negotiations behind the scenes, preliminary discussions to establishing the scope for the agreement, and the planning. So even though the council member did not participate in the formal meeting to approve the agreement, there was a lot of communications behind the scenes at these steps, which were identified by the public. Those, again, were public records. Those emails from a private email address to staff and the applicant became part of the public record. And that case is currently being considered by the FPPC to figure out what is the best, most appropriate response to that activity, which did run afoul of these financial conflicts of interest prohibitions. More to come on that one. Chances are that will be a slide in a future AB 1234 presentation to discuss lessons learned and what not to do. Again, the application of Government Code 1090, if you have an interest, you need to recuse yourself. If it's a non-interest, you can okay to vote. If it's a remote interest, you cannot vote and participate, but again, the city council can make the contract. If it's direct or indirect to you, you cannot vote or participate, and the city cannot make the contract. This is the example I used of the janitorial services, which was direct to the council member. If the council member had it was indirect to a spouse, again, that would still accrue to that council member, and they would be prohibited from participating, and even the council could not approve that particular contract. What are the consequences of a 1090 violation? They're severe. The contract is void and unenforceable. The official must return any money that was received, but the city council can keep the benefits received. And this particular bullet point comes from a case where a council member sold a piece of land, entered into a contract with the city to sell a piece of land to the city. The court said no, that contract is void. It's a violation of 1090 because the agency cannot contract with the council member directly, as well as the result was the city got to keep the land, and the council member had to pay the money back to the city. That seems to be an unfair and unjust result from certain perspectives, but again, that's how jealously the law protects 1090 violations and the public's money. Again, there's also potential for criminal violations, particularly if it's willful. That could be determined to be a felony and charged as a felony. And in that situation, if upheld and found to be in violation, there's not only a forfeiture of office of that particular office, but there's a disqualification from the holding of future public office. This is what we've seen. This existed prior to Bell, but it's definitely been reinforced post-Bell and has become that much more aggressive. Turning back again to the Political Reform Act and determining what are your financial conflicts of interest. There's a 4-step test. The tests are: 1, is it reasonably foreseeable that the decision will have a financial effect on the official's economic interests? If so, will that financial effect be material? Again, if it does, then we need to do a secondary step. Is that effect indistinguishable from the effect on the public generally? And the last one is the official making, participating, or attempting to influence a decision. That should have been the first one because we would know when we're dealing with that at the front end. But that's the tests that are applied by the FPPC through the Political Reform Act. Again, is it reasonably foreseeable that the decision will have a financial effect on your economic interests? Again, is your economic interest expressly involved? Again, using an example, is my business the one who's going to receive the contract? Okay, that's directly involved. Is the financial effect realistically possible, a realistic possibility, and more than hypothetical or theoretical? If you understand what that means, help me out. That particular language was derived by the state legislature to provide additional guidance to help determine what is reasonably foreseeable. Adding adjectives, I think, didn't provide clarity. I think it provided greater uncertainty, which is why we need to really sit down with you. If you have a financial interest that may be triggered or may be affected by this, to sit down and figure out what this means for that particular project or that particular decision. Now, what are your financial interests? For a business, any investment of $2,000 or more in a for-profit organization or a business position, officer, president, vice president, those would be your financial interest in a business. Real property, any equity or lease in real property worth more than $2,000. Again, for a source of income, it's even a lower threshold. Any provided promises of $500 or more in the prior 12 months. Again, if you think this is a round number, it harkens back to your gift limits. So think of that. Again, your source of gifts, we already talked about that, $500 or more of 12 months. Again, those are your financial interests when it comes to decision making. And again, your personal finances, your expenses, your income, your assets, your liabilities. Those are what are held to be your financial interests. Again, business, direct investment, $2,000 or more, or holding positions, director, officer, partner, trustee, employee, position of management. If you have any of these, you're needing to have an interest in a business. For real property, again, direct or indirect investment of $2,000 or more, fair market value. In leases, again, if it's a month-to-month, this would not be an interest in real property, but if you have a long-term lease that's over a month, then yes, that would be an interest. And this is a new one. In property within the city or within 2 miles of the city. This last part was added recently in recognition that of how cities have a sphere of influence. They have their planning area that are outside their city limits, but that could eventually trigger a financial conflict of interest. Again, real property, direct investment, you are on title. Indirect could be you, investment by your spouse or domestic partner, or a business entity in which you or a family member has an interest of 10% or more. And it says immediate family member because that's somebody within your immediate household or who basically lives with you. Sources of income, again, any source of income of $500 or more in any 12-month period to you or your spouse, domestic partner, again, or to a child within your household. And also to apply to any obligation or debt of $500 or more that is forgiven. So if you've got an outstanding loan or a payment that you need to make that's forgiven, again, that results in a positive income to you, so that would be recognized as a financial conflict of interest potentially, or as a source of income. Gifts, we talked about gifts previously. Any source of gifts, $500 or more provided to you or spouse within a 12-month decision, that's a disqualifying gift. Your personal finances, again, what's your personal financial effect? You may have economic interest, government decision if your personal expensive income or assets or liabilities are involved. Again, this is up or down as well. One FEPC opinion I did work with an office previously to solicit when I was with the city of Thousand Oaks. The mayor at that time was a well-known attorney who wanted to participate in some CEQA litigation on behalf of the city. He was actually prepared to forego any compensation for that work. He was willing to say, I don't want one penny from the city. I believe in this cause so much, I will take it on in my own capacity on behalf of the city. The opinion letter was sent to the FPPC. They determined that that would result in a financial interest to him. One, through the loss, he's going to have a cost associated with that. He would have to pay the litigation costs, his staff time, his resources. So it would be a negative impact, but they thought that that was a financial effect, and they thought that that was disqualifying, so that he couldn't participate in that decision-making process. The FPPC actually went to the next step and found that that particular engagement would lead to notoriety, which would bring, if he were successful, or just the fact that he was leading that litigation, would bring potential financial gain to him in the future through notoriety. And so the FPPC found two reasons to recommend that he be disqualified and not participate in that particular activity. Next step, once you know our financial interest, will the financial effect be material? Again, if the economic interest is expressly involved in that decision, then it is presumed to be material. If you have a contract for janitorial services with a contract, again, 1090 violation, but if it's with you personally, it's presumed to be material. The key issue when deciding whether an official has a conflict is how significant an effect the decision would have on their financial interest. This is complex determination, and we have to evaluate what is the effect on that. If you have an interest that's involved, we will definitely want to sit down with you and work through these particular issues. We can also solicit FPPC guidance through a formal letter or look through their formal opinions. Their opinions are posted online. They do continue to evolve from year to year, but determining whether it's material using that loose standard we discussed previously, definitely let's get together to discuss materiality. Step 3, is the effect distinguishable from the effect of the public generally? If it is, your conflict, if it's unique to you, you need to recuse. If it's not, it's the same as effect as felt throughout the community, you can participate. But again, this is a question I had consistently with the FEPC when I first started practicing back in the early 90s, which was who has the burden of proof on this? The FEPC has clarified that is incumbent upon the public official to establish that this segment of the public is affected and that his official or her official financial interest is not unique compared to the rest of the significance. So one of the questions was who has the burden of proof for this particular element, and the FEPC has now clarified that that's incumbent upon the official, that they have to prove that their effect is no different than the public generally, rather than somebody on the other side saying, no, you have a greater impact. So just be cognizant that this rule is now clear. Step 4, are you participating, making, or attempting to influence a decision? We walk through that. Again, that includes voting, providing advice, using your position of influence in the decision in any way possible. And again, I use that example of the city councilor who did recuse themselves from the actual participating in the council chambers, but continued to, from one person's perspective, engage in undue influence or use their influence behind the scenes. And again, the FEPC will provide guidance on that decision probably within the next year or so. Again, what is the basic rule? You're not to use or participate in the governmental process to influence a governmental decision that could benefit you. And if you don't have an exception, you're required to recuse yourself. If there's a financial conflict of interest, you must publicly identify that interest. Step down for participating in the decision and state the reason. Leave the room when the matter is discussed. You need to go sit in the green room or exit the council chambers. And we as staff want to confirm that the record reflects these actions have been taken. There is a very significant exception, which is participation in private capacity. If you are applying to the city, say for a land use permit, and you were the applicant, again, you're not participating as a council member to approve that decision. You have to recuse and step down, but you still have the same rights as any individual to apply to the city for an application. So that would be allowed under these particular rules. There's additional exceptions, one is which is the rule of necessity. Another example I have is one of my former councils in Southern California was preparing to enter into a contract for banking services. Well, my 5 council members were all business people within the community who did business with each and every one of the banks within the community. There was only a handful of them. In that situation, the guidance is clear in the law that you draw lots. And so that's what we had as a hat with each council member's name written on a piece of paper. Those names were put into the hat, and they were drawn until you got to a majority of the council. Once you achieved a quorum of 3, those 3 then could participate in making the decision of whether to engage a particular bank in banking services. We've had similar situations involving planning commissioners here in Livermore, where we've had planning commissioners who we lost a quorum because they were had to recuse themselves because they were within so many feet of a particular project. Again, of those that were recused, we then drew lots and drew planning commissioners' names until we had a quorum and then could participate and actually consider the item. So there's an interesting process. We have occasion to use that every so often, but it is definitely an exception to the rule, but it does exist should we so need it. Now, what are the consequences of violating the Political Reform Act? Again, the decision may be invalidated. There are administrative fines of $5,000 per violation in this situation. Again, civil actions may be brought by the residents. They can be awarded attorney's fees and multipliers if there's been a violation, someone received inappropriate compensation or monetary compensation or money from the city. And there also can be criminal penalties. Again, if it's a misdemeanor, there's knowing violations, you get fines that's greater than $10,000 or 3 times the amount involved. Again, if an official is convicted, they will be removed from office and then also disqualified from holding future office. So when you're dealing with money and engaging in dealing with your financial interests, please be aware of what your financial interests are, and if they are potentially affected by a decision, do engage myself and staff early to help you run through this analysis, and where necessary, let's obtain an opinion from the FPPC to determine whether they believe you can or cannot participate. Again, this is similar to the headlines that we've been talking about involving the Public Works Director in San Francisco right now. Similar to this headline, where they paid $2.5 million for a repair job that was done by city forces. One of the allegations in the San Francisco situation that's currently being vetted is whether the director received personal financial benefit from contractors with the city from performing work on his private residence, or at least one of his residences up in the northern coast, up in, I think it was the Mendocino area. So again, understand your financial interests, make sure your financial life is separate from your public life, and make sure your personal finances don't benefit from your public decisions. Again, when in doubt, seek advice from your city attorney. There is an informational hotline. Call 1-866-ASK-FPPC for informal advice. Again, that'll help you identify whether you have a question that needs to be delved into deeper, but that is available for you to call at any time. If a question is more involved, they will request that you seek a formal FPPC written opinion. And again, without that opinion, if you take the action and it is in fact a violation and they do want to prosecute, they can prosecute you if you only received informal advice. But if you received an FPPC written opinion and the facts are consistent with what was presented to the FPPC to make that opinion, you basically are given the opportunity to participate, and they will not prosecute you or bring an action against you. All right, any questions on that aspect before we turn to personal advantages and perks?
Let's roll.
I just want to say I'm still here.
Excuse me?
There's just been a lot, I just thought this is a lot of information, and I just wanted to check in and say hi.
Oh, very good. It is a lot of information. It can be overwhelming at times, which is why we do this at least every 2 years. And we do reinforce this on a regular basis when we come across these. So staff will identify these issues for you on occasion. We'll know when you're engaged in the decision-making process. We have an idea of some of your financial interests. We are engaged with transparency, so we will help you through these issues and help you identify them as we see them, but we want to make sure that you guys are apprised of this as well so you can deal with this in your personal capacity. So moving on to personal advantages and perks. Again, the general rule is that public servants should not receive special benefits by virtue of their positions. There are several areas of concern we're going to cover here this afternoon, and now we're into this evening. Mass mailing restrictions, gift of public funds, misuse of public resources, abuse of public office, travel, and campaign contributions. We'll go through these slides rather quickly because some of these items we've already covered previously today, but I do need to cover these based upon the direction from AB 1234. Mass mailing. Mass mailings are 200 or more substantially similar pieces of mail sent in the calendar month, prepared or sent at the public's expense, and that feature an elected official. So features is a broadly defined term. Feature means that you have an article about you, you have a photograph of you. So feature, if you are simply listed in the banner or the flyer, the pre-printed portion of a letter, that's fine. But this prohibition attaches to make sure that council members are not using mailers as campaign materials or materials to give themselves an advantage in a campaign later on. So this is a very rigid rule with regard to mass mailings, and it gets even more rigid when it comes within 60 days of an election. Even if you were able to have a mailing that didn't feature an elected official, when you're getting within 60 days of an election, prohibits certain otherwise, these items that would otherwise be okay if it's in time, it's in advance of an election. So we've been working with you with your community newsletter with this new rule that attached recently. So we make sure that is completely devoid of any specific council member mentions prior to 60 days to an election to avoid running afoul of this mass mailing prohibition. Now, you can't prepare it at public expense featuring an incumbent or elected official. Why? To conserve public funds, to avoid the arbitrary preference of a candidate over another by reason of incumbency. Again, we use cautions when sending out a month. We make sure it doesn't contain an elected official's name, office, pictures, or other references. But again, the mass mailing only applies to mail. It doesn't apply to website or electronic distribution. So mail is not email. Mail is what we commonly understand as the U.S. mail. What are the consequences if violated? Again, criminal and civil sanctions attach. Fines up to $5,000 per violation and potentially attorney's fees. So again, the goal is to make sure that incumbents and elected officials don't have an unfair advantage or an undue advantage when it comes to an election, and the rules are becoming that much more rigid that we even more circumspect in the 60 days prior to it. Again, so personal advantages and perks, gifts of public funds. The California Constitution is clear. All expenditures of public funds must be for a public purpose. And so what is the test? Is the expenditure for a public purpose? Does it advance the agency's purpose? So one of the questions may be, who gets to make that determination? So that's incumbent upon you as a city council. If you can find the expenditures have a public benefit or a public reason to do that, you can make the determination and it would not be a gift of public funds. For example, the Home Street Wall is a good example of this particular rule in action. There is a currently existing wall that is the city's wall. The city's program was directed staff to engage in a program to remove that wall and to build a new wall for the residents. That wall will be the residence wall in the after condition. It will actually be a fence. But you may ask yourself, well, what was the public benefit from that? Well, the council, in fact, determined there was a public benefit to engaging in rebuilding that fence for those property owners to maintain a consistent appearance along Home Street. So that was the public purpose that was found for the expenditures of those funds. Absent that public purpose or the public benefit, the city could not go build a fence or a wall or a house for a private individual. The council has the ability to make those determinations, but should not be using that for personal or private benefit. Again, misuse of public resources. Again, this falls in line with campaigns. It says that no local officer, appointee, employee, or consultant shall use or permit others to use public resources for campaign purposes, personnel or otherwise, for any authorized purpose. So what is the rule? I'm getting a little tongue-tied here. The rule is if you're campaigning for office, you cannot use city employees to call out for you. You can't use city resources to host a campaign. You can't use city resources to put up signs. You can't use city resources for anything that is campaign related. Seems to make sense, but we actually just want to call it there are laws that do prohibit that particular activity. Again, personal unauthorized purpose means any personal enjoyment, private gain, or advantage. Public resources is very broadly. That includes land, buildings, facilities, funds, equipment, supplies, telephones, computers, vehicles, travel, or any government compensated time. Basically, keep your campaign and your private life separate from your public persona when you're elected, and you'll be fine. But it's important not to use public resources for campaign or for private benefit. Application city resources include letterhead. We talked about that earlier this evening with regard to the use of letterhead. And you've given us direction that when you're using it in your official capacity to recognize individuals' work or participation with the city, that's a fine use of letterhead. But again, city resources also include computers, email, telephone, vehicles, personnel. What happens if you do misuse public resources? Violations, again, can result in fines, imprisonment, and the loss of office or employment. If you're using it for personal benefit or gain, you may also run afoul of other rules we discussed previously, 1090, FPPC violations with regard to having making decisions or using public resources for your personal benefit. Again, the City of Bell is just a good example of how things can go wrong. But again, they use the public resources for their personal benefit, receiving income from multiple city commissions for their own for using city vehicles and other uses for their own personal benefit. Don't do that. It is catastrophic, the effect that could have upon your community, and it'll be unclear when that city will ever regain the public trust and be able to function as a well-run city like Livermore does. Again, personal advantages of the perks, abuse of public office. We talked about this previously. That includes bribes, waste, fraud, any violation of law or color of authority, among others. This term, deprivation of honest services. That's where you are engaging in due process and fairness. You are not engaged in it for public's concern, but if you are engaged in it for personal gain, that is termed to be deprivation of honest services. We are seeing an example of that again in the allegations involving the Public Works Director and other officials out in the city of San Francisco. We'll see what that results in. But again, you want to make sure you're doing this public's business on behalf of the public, not for personal gain. Again, if the public official employees get convicted of abuse of public office, they must reimburse the agency for those funds. Reimbursable funds can include paid leave, defense costs, cash settlements for termination. There's a whole host of things that can be derived. Again, this came as a result of Bell to make sure that the public gets repaid by those individuals who took the public's money. With regard to travel, I want to focus on this because the rule is extremely unforgiving. The rule is no public officer shall accept a free pass or discount from a transportation company. This applies to transportation received from or to anywhere. Both are personal and business uses, and applies to elected and appointed officials, but not to employees. What this rule is it was derived and it's in the California Constitution because of the railroad companies. They would offer perks to elected officials seeking favor for their projects within their communities, and the legislature wanted to make sure, the public wanted to make sure, and the Constitution makes sure that those officials aren't beholden to a travel company, don't receive those perks to go from point A to point B as a result of their official capacity. And the remedy, if you do that, is forfeiture of office. So those of you who may have engaged and been offered travel in the past will get a call from me when I hear about it very quickly. For myself and the city manager, we're going to engage you to make sure that, one, it is travel that can be accepted and meets one of the exceptions. And if not, to make sure you don't engage in that, because the forfeiture is automatic. So we want to be very, very clear about when you accept travel. Now, can you accept travel? Yes, there are certain exceptions to that travel prohibition. Travels from a non-reportable source, travel from a government agency for training, sharing a ride with another official for training, certain travel from a government agency or 501c3. This is what is triggered when we have a situation, which is our sister city program. If a city in a foreign country wants to pay, or government entity in a foreign country wants to pay to have us travel, or you travel as a council member to go visit their city for official business, they can do that. That is a travel exception, but we have to follow the rules and make sure we have our Form 700 and make our disclosures appropriately. But you can accept travel in those limited circumstances. To add a belt to those suspenders, we make sure when we had traveling to the sister city programs in China and visiting different places in China, that we received an FPPC opinion that was approving those particular use of those travel funds and how they were recorded. Again, travel for official city business is fine. Travel payments when fulfilling terms of a contract, that's fine. One thing to be, before I move on to that slide, let me go back. We do need to make sure that the travel is for official city business. If you were to receive an upgrade, so if you walked into an airport and they had an opportunity to say, hey, anybody who's on this plane now, we have the ability to put your name in a hat to get an upgrade to a first class seat. And you have to put your name in that hat and get that upgrade to a first class seat, that's fine. That wasn't a result of your official capacity. If, however, the same airline were to come out and say, hey, we have an upgrade to a first class seat to the first elected official who stands up, don't stand up. That would result in a disqualification. I had a chance to see something similar to that when I was flying on a trip from Southern California to Las Vegas. They were going to give an upgrade to a council member, not my council member, but a council member from a neighboring city, and I did admonish them very quickly, don't take it. Don't take it there. They recognized the individual as a council member, and we're going to give them an upgrade. I says, don't take this. I went through what the California Constitution said. They were appreciative. They were unfamiliar with that particular statute, but don't take travel when it's given to you as an elected official. If it's given to you as just a member of the public and participating as a member of the public, that would be fine. So, word of caution. Okay, the city is available to reimburse you for actual necessary travel expenses. Again, we have a city written policy for that. We did adopt a policy. It's an interim policy in response to AB 1234. We'll probably need to update that at some point. We do have a policy about what the city does and does not reimburse. This official must timely submit their expense report to the city with receipts. And as we're aware, during your report out, during your city council meetings, you make an oral report about any meetings or that you attend at the city's expense. And that's one of the reasons why we have that component on our agendas to make sure you're complying with this. Campaign contributions and as a personal advantage and perk. Again, official may not solicit campaign contributions for any agency officers or employees unless a solicitation is sent to a significant segment of the public that may include agency officers and employees. What does that mean? If you were to send a targeted campaign solicitation to all city employees and city employees only, that would run afoul of this prohibition. If you were to submit a campaign solicitation for fundraising to the community at large, just because a public employee may receive that solicitation doesn't make it inappropriate. So just want to make sure you're aware of that particular nuance. This one is more appropriate for your planning commissioners, but I want to make sure you're aware of this. Candidates for office that are appointed officials may not. So if you have a planning commissioner who's been appointed to the planning commission who's seeking to run for city council, that individual may not solicit, accept, or direct campaign contributions more than $250 from a party participant in an entitlement proceeding before the officer's body, where the officer sought while proceeding is pending, or for 3 months after that decision. What does that mean? If an applicant is before the planning commission and wants to support that planning commissioner for candidacy for the city council, they need to be aware of these campaign contribution limitations and time durations to make sure they don't run afoul of this particular statute. So again, we watch for that to the extent we can. If it's publicly available, we will help the planning commissioners with that decision-making process. But it's also incumbent upon our planning commissioners to be aware of this, and we do train them on this during their individual AB 1234 training. The candidate rule does not apply to elected officials while sitting on a body in which they were elected or as ex officio appointing of another agency. So what does this mean? This means if you were given a campaign contribution for a regional body that you were to sit on, there's an applicant, say, before ACTC or one of your other regional bodies, this rule would not attach. It only attaches, again, when we have an appointed official, such as a planning commissioner, who would be seeking or receiving a campaign contribution for an applicant before them within the city. Again, it's a hyper-technical rule, but we do walk through the planning commissioners with that. Again, candidate officers may not participate in an entitlement decision if the party or applicant participant in the proceeding party, so your person making your contribution is a party. The party makes a campaign contribution of $250 or more to you as a candidate within 12 months. And both the official and contributor must disclose the contribution on the record before a record of the proceeding. What is this particular rule? This is why your campaign contribution limits were previously set at $250. So this rule didn't come into play. This rule means that if you have an applicant who's a campaign contributor to your campaign, and then comes before you with an application, you then have to recuse yourself. So if it's more than $250 in the campaign contribution, you would need to step down from participating in that decision within 12 months of that contribution being made. So I want to highlight this because this is a new nuance with your campaign ordinance when we remove the campaign restriction of $250. So if you receive a campaign contribution of more than $250 from a particular contributor, please be aware of those contributions, because if that person becomes an applicant before the city council for an entitlement, a permit, or other item, you would then be required to recuse yourself from participating in that particular matter. So that's a new nuance. I want to make sure we're all aware of that. I've been speaking to you consistently for quite a while now. There are different resources, additional resources we can obtain information. California Attorney General at this webpage, the Fair Political Practices Commission. Again, I mentioned them previously. The Institute for Local Government is a really good resource, and this one in particular is Ethics, Law, Information. If you need further guidance or want to seek additional information, that's a really good source to start at. They take these complicated and complex laws and actually simplify them more than I have this evening, but they also have the opportunity to take more pages than I have this evening. But that's a really good source should you have additional questions. So what are the takeaways from our presentation this evening? One, be aware of your financial interests, both direct and indirect. Avoid personal financial gain when engaging in the decision-making process. Again, use public funds for public purposes, not for personal gain. Conduct the public's business open and fairly. And then also, our last recommendation to avoid, we step way back from that line, our recommendation is to avoid the appearance of impropriety. Again, the law is the floor, and it helps if we stay well away from that floor. That way, we avoid misunderstandings or people leading to unfortunate conclusions or beliefs based upon certain activities that may be innocent in the activity, but may be perceived otherwise by people who see it differently. So with that, I think I've almost talked myself hoarse, but I'd like to turn it over back to you, Mr. Mayor, to see if there are any questions on any topic we covered here this evening. Do you have any questions on anything we haven't covered this evening, but within the scope of the Brown Act and these ethics laws that you have any questions on? Or are there any other questions you have with regard to ethics and what you might want to consider in your role as a city council member? With that,
Well, great.
Mr. Mayor, that concludes
Thank
my
you very
presentation.
much.
Back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A lot of stuff, a lot of information, and it just goes back to, as I've always said, that if you need ethics training, it's not going to help, because this is one of those things that really has to come from within you. So with that, Councilmember Monroe, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I wanted to, first of all, thank you, Mr. Akala, for talking yourself hoarse. It was quite a feat. I appreciate it. And then I had a couple comments, maybe a question. Comment is that one of the first things I did after in early 2019 was to attend an ethics training. It was part of the League of
Yes.
California Cities preparation, and was all new. It strikes me just how much this has become ingrained, just having lived it for a year and a half. So this is something, so I guess I want to express my appreciation also for your training over a period of time. That also speaks to something you said, Mayor Marchand, at the forum, which this was around a different topic, which was implicit racism, which is, this is something that you don't just get trained in over a day, you get trained in over a period of time. With that in mind, though, I would also say this was quite overwhelming. A lot of information. I'm wondering if we might want to think about doing this a different way, just so that we maybe take one topic at a time, and delve into it a little bit more. Having, this a little bit contradicts this now feels familiar. At the same time, I am curious to have sort of more of a discussion around some of these issues. And with 5 or however many topics we just covered, that's really not possible. It is too overwhelming. My final point is these takeaways, I think, are incredibly important. I would love to see them posted somewhere for the city to see. Politicians get a bad rap. I think that these takeaways are intended to keep that from happening, to inspire trust, and having that conversation with the city around this would not be a bad thing. So my comments.
The one the one law that just fascinated me was the one that if you take a free ride from any public conveyance, you forfeit your office. I mean, that's it's all about the robber barons. It's all about the railroad barons. But that was the one that really, really got my attention. That it's non-negotiable. You forfeit your office, and I think that was remarkable in the fact that was done generations ago, when they saw just how just the potential for corruption. So it hasn't always worked that way, but they saw that was something that really could unduly influence decisions, and that was that cut and dried. Vice Mayor Warner.
I also want to say thank you for all of this information, and it is a lot. And I agree that some of the key pieces of this should be posted for the public to see. The other question I have along those lines is, do we have any reports as to whether we've had any issues in any of these areas?
Reports as in logging complaints, violations, or things of that nature?
Well,
if that's what you're...
Yeah, I think you're right about the difference between complaints, the thing, what was that about, arrested so many times but never convicted. No, I was just wondering, there is a lot of information. It covers broad scope of things. And do we have any way of assuring the public that we're actually not a bell?
Well, how about we're not making $100,000 a year? That's a good start.
Well, that's a good one, but I was just wondering, is along these lines, is there any kind of tracking reporting on these issues with respect to, how we're doing? I don't know of any. I was just thinking that maybe there aren't any, and so therefore we're really good, but I don't know.
Well, so I'll put myself out as an example. I used to pour for one of the local wineries, and you don't get paid, but you get compensated in wine. And they brought an application to the city, and we realized that over the course of the previous year, my compensation in retail wine value was over $500. So at that point, I voluntarily recused myself just to make sure that there wasn't any whiff of controversy.
That's
So-
good. I'm just asking the city attorney, do we have any tracking or reporting of us having any issues in this area?
So with regard to tracking and reporting, no, there's nothing that's formally in place, but I will highlight the following. You as a city council reinforce your commitment to good government, to open transparency, to being fiscally responsible, to avoiding the appearance of impropriety at each of your council meetings. Through what you do, what you reinforce in your community and public engagement. So while we're not checking boxes at every single meeting, you're living this. I think the example you're setting is reflected in the community through the community's trust and the public trust. So I would say that we don't have a rigid process where we're tracking this, but you're reinforcing this at each one of your council meetings. This is being reinforced at each one of your advisory body meetings, both from a staff perspective and from a liaison perspective and from the advisory body members' perspective. I think you have given examples here this evening of your own commitment to this process and these ideals. But as far as a box checking, no, I'm not aware of anything like that.
I wasn't saying box checking. I'm just, you showed the headlines of various things going wrong in cities. And we haven't had any of those headlines here. So that's one test, right? I would think that if any actions were brought, it would be in some kind of public record that would be available for people. I mean, if it's any
There we do have one, so I can highlight one case that is actually going through active litigation involving the city right now. We have a gentleman who believed the city council denied him the opportunity to speak on an item before the city council. The U.S. District Court evaluated those allegations and found there was no violation, found the city was extremely respectful to him, gave him every opportunity to focus his comments on the item that was under discussion, and basically dismissed his action. That individual, again, is continuing to press the matter, and that item is currently pending before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. I'm confident that the Ninth Circuit will again confirm what we know, that the city is respectful of the Brown Act and people's rights to speak, and will confirm your rules of procedure and what occurred at that particular meeting as being proper.
And those
But
proceedings are publicly filed, right?
That is correct.
Right, that's all.
That's the only item that I'm aware of that's out there.
That's all I'm trying to say is I think we have a very good, we have set a good record and we have a good record. And I was just asking, in addition to saying what Councilmember Monroe said, of posting so that the public can see this, what we're adhering to, the fact that we do adhere to it. One way is that there's no scandal being published, but I was just asking, is there some way that if we could have some kind of simple scorecard or something to say, look, we're good. I mean, that's all. It was just simply, as you pointed out, we are ascribing, to transparency and all of that. So I was just wondering.
Well, I think anybody can pull up the Form 700. Those are all public documents, and so they can see if we have accepted any gifts. Of course, if somebody like the gentleman that collected the $2.3 million, he's obviously not going to put that down on his Form 700. But those documents, the Form 700 is a public record. And I'll tell you, from my perspective, I only know of 2 cases in the last 30 years, at least in the Tri-Valley, where you had elected officials that sort of went overboard, and that was close to 30 years ago. One of them involved a local board voting themselves medical benefits for life, but that was a Brown Act violation. It was not agendized, and the grand jury got a hold of it, and they eventually backed off. But
And-
there's only one other person that voted on a project that saw personal benefit, but that was 30 years ago.
So and that's great. I'm just saying that the record here is really exemplary.
Yeah.
But how would anybody know, other than absence of any,
Gross impropriety.
any impropriety there. So that was it. I just wanted to highlight that we're good. That's all.
We are.
I'll reinforce that with a statement I use quite frequently with my staff, which is, if you do your job right, people will think you've done nothing at all. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah. All right. I see no further questions. All right. Well, with that, thank you ever so much for your participation. Thanks for all the great information. And let's see, we'll adjourn this to our next meeting of June 22nd, also by Zoom. So we'll see you all then. Thank you very much. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.